There is a verse in the Bible so easy to miss that most people have read past it 100 times without ever stopping. It sits buried in the 5th chapter of Genesis, a chapter that reads like a ledger, name after name, lifespan after lifespan, each entry following the same rhythm with the mechanical patience of a courthouse record. Adam lived 930 years and died. Seth lived 912 years and died. Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, each one born, each one a father, each one dead. The pattern is so consistent, it becomes almost invisible. The way a heartbeat becomes invisible until it stops, and then it stops. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. No grave, no final breath, no mourners recorded. A man who was here and then simply wasn't, in a chapter that is essentially a list of endings. Enoch is the one name that doesn't end, and the Bible offers no explanation, no vision, no divine speech, no dramatic scene, just those few quiet words, and then the list continues as if nothing unusual had happened. That silence is not an oversight. That silence is the oldest invitation in Scripture. Come and ask. Come and look closer. There is something here worth stopping for. The Book of Enoch begins exactly where that silence begins. But before we follow Enoch into the visions, the heavens, the watchers, the throne of fire, we need to stand where he stood, not as a theological concept, not as a symbol of holiness, but as a man, a real man, with dust on his sandals and questions in his chest. Born into a world that was already more complicated and more broken than most of us have ever stopped to imagine. Enoch entered the world as the 7th generation from Adam. That number matters more than it first appears. His great-great-great-great-grandfather was the first human being to draw breath. The memory of Eden was not ancient mythology to the people of Enoch's time. It was family history. The garden was real. The voice in the cool of the evening was real. The loss was recent enough that it still had texture, still had the specific ache of something loved and surrendered. The world Enoch was born into carried that ache in its bones. 2 lines of humanity had formed in the generations after the fall, and they were moving in opposite directions. The line of Cain had built cities, not primitive settlements, but genuine centers of power and culture. Genesis tells us they invented musical instruments, developed the working of bronze and iron, and produced the arts of civilization at a remarkable pace. They were not simple people. In many ways they were brilliant, but there was something hollow at the center of everything they built. A hunger that no wall or weapon or song could fill. And when people are genuinely hungry and cannot find the right food, they will eat anything. Violence entered through that door, not in a single catastrophic moment, but gradually. The way a room darkens, not all at once, but by degrees. First, the shadows lengthening in the corners. Then the shapes of familiar things growing uncertain. Then the darkness becoming so normal that people stopped noticing it was dark at all. A man named Lamech boasted to his wives that he had killed someone for wounding him. Not in shame, in triumph. The celebration of cruelty had arrived. And it had arrived wearing the face of culture. The line of Seth was different, but not immune. Genesis 4:26 records that in those days, people began to call on the name of the Lord. A small flame of people who had not forgotten the name of their Creator. Enoch was born into that flame. But being born near a fire doesn't mean you carry it. Every generation has to choose whether to tend what they were given or let it cool. The ancient Jewish writings surrounding the Book of Enoch describe Enoch as a child who sat apart, while others played and chased and filled the evenings with noise. He would climb to the higher places and look at the stars with a hunger he couldn't name. Not sadness, hunger, the kind that pulls a person upward, that makes ordinary life feel like a room that is slightly too small. He wasn't cold or strange. He loved deeply, as we'll see. But there was something in him that the world around him simply could not satisfy. He was hungry for God. And the extraordinary claim at the heart of this ancient text is that God was hungry for him too. Genesis says Enoch walked with God for 300 years. Not 3 years, not 3 decades, 3 centuries of daily, unbroken, intimate closeness with the Creator of the universe. The Hebrew word for walked with is hithalic, reflexive, repeated form that doesn't describe a single journey, but a continuous back-and-forth movement. 2 people who travel the same road long enough that their footsteps begin to fall in rhythm. This is not the emotional high of a single powerful experience. This is 300 years of showing up, of choosing every morning, regardless of how the world looked or how the silence felt, to walk toward the one who made him rather than away. Most of us struggle to maintain any spiritual practice for 3 months. Enoch did it for 3 centuries. And in doing so, he became something the world had never quite seen. A man so aligned with heaven that heaven began to open to him. Not because he was appointed in some pre-birth spectacular fashion, but because 300 years of faithful nearness made him transparent. The kind of transparency that allows light to pass through something completely. This is the detail most retellings of the Book of Enoch miss entirely. The visions didn't come as a reward. The fallen angels, the throne room, the hidden Son of Man. None of it was the point. The walking was the point. The visions were what happened naturally when someone refused to let go of the source of all light for long enough that the light simply poured through them. Enoch was written for people carrying weight they didn't choose. His first words in the ancient text describe a blessing for those living in difficult times. For those who would feel the darkness pressing in and need to know it was not the whole story. He was writing for tonight. When Adam and Eve walked out of Eden, they carried something with them that doesn't get talked about enough. Not just shame, not just the knowledge of good and evil, not just the curse of thorns and sweat and pain. They carried the memory of what it had actually felt like, the texture of it, the specific warmth of it, to walk in the presence of God in the cool of the evening, to hear His voice without flinching, to live inside a world that was whole. That memory didn't die with them. It passed down through their children and their children's children like a physical inheritance, growing fainter at the edges with each generation, but never quite extinguished. It became something like a wound that wouldn't close, a longing for something most people couldn't name, but everyone could feel. The sense that the world was slightly wrong, that something had been lost, that somewhere just beyond the reach of ordinary life, there was a wholeness that humanity had once held and thrown away. Different people responded to that wound in very different ways. Some reached upward. Genesis 4:26 records that in the days of Enoch, the grandson of Adam, people began to call on the name of the Lord. A remnant, small, quiet, easily overlooked, who responded to the ache by crying out toward the one who had made them. They didn't have temples or written scriptures or organized religion. They had the memory, however faded. And they had the hunger, and they had the name, and they called it into whatever sky was above them, trusting that it still reached something. But most people responded differently. Most people responded by trying to fill the wound with something else. This is where the line of Cain becomes one of the most uncomfortable mirrors in all of ancient literature. Because what they built looks remarkably like what every civilization since has tried to build. They built cities. They built systems of security and accumulation. They developed culture and craft with genuine brilliance. Genesis tells us they invented musical instruments, mastered metallurgy, created the arts of civilization at a pace that would have impressed any observer. The line of Cain was not primitive. In the world's terms, they were extraordinary. But there was a logic underneath everything they built. A logic that Genesis traces with quiet precision. The city is a substitute for the garden. Human achievement becomes a replacement for divine presence. We don't need the voice in the evening. We have walls. We don't need the Creator's protection. We have weapons. We don't need to call on any name beyond our own. We have enough. That logic works. For a while, it always works. The walls hold. The weapons protect. The culture flourishes. And then the hunger that was never actually answered comes back. Louder. And the only response left is to build higher walls and sharper weapons and more elaborate culture. And the hunger comes back louder still. The celebration of cruelty had become cultural. And culture, once it absorbs something into its assumptions, stops seeing it as a choice. It simply becomes how things are. Now here is where the world of Enoch begins to look uncomfortable. Because the line of Seth was not immune. The ancient texts surrounding the Book of Enoch describe the slow erosion across the generations. The faithful remnant intermarrying with the line of Cain, adopting their values, trading the hunger for God for the satisfaction of things they could hold and measure and own. Not in dramatic acts of apostasy, not in conscious rejection, but in the slow, ordinary drift of people who stopped tending the flame and found one morning that it had gone cold. By the time Enoch reached adulthood, the boundary between the two lines had blurred almost beyond recognition. The world was darker in a way that went beyond ordinary moral failure, and Enoch could feel it. Not abstractly, not theologically, but the way a person feels the change in air pressure before a storm. Something was wrong beneath the surface of daily life. Something was entering the human world from outside. He was not the only one who noticed, but he was one of the very few who understood why the noticing mattered. The ancient Jewish writings describe him, even as a young man, as someone who moved through the world with a quality of attention most people around him lacked. He watched things. He listened to what the silence between sounds was saying. He paid attention to the stars, not the way a navigator pays attention to them, calculating position and distance, but the way a person listens to someone they love, for what the words beneath the words might be. His neighbors had, by and large, stopped looking up. The cities of the line of Cain produced light enough at night that the stars were easier to ignore. The culture was loud enough that the deeper silence was easy to miss. The accumulation of things that could be held and measured and owned gave enough of an answer to the wound that most people stopped asking what had caused it. Enoch kept asking. Every morning on the hillside. Every evening, watching the light change over the valley below. Every long night, when the questions had no answers, and the silence of heaven felt longer than it should. He kept asking, not with the aggression of someone demanding answers, but with the patient persistence of someone who has decided that the question itself is worth more than any false comfort that might make it go away. That persistence would eventually become something the world had never seen. But first, it had to be tested by the world. The world was becoming a world that was about to get much darker, much faster than even Enoch was prepared for. The two roads had diverged far enough now that what came next was almost inevitable. Not because evil always wins, but because a world that has stopped asking the right questions eventually stops being able to recognize the answers even when they arrive. The darkness that was coming was not ordinary. It had been chosen, deliberately, with full knowledge, with an oath sworn on a mountaintop in the thin air between heaven and earth. And it was about to change everything. There is a kind of faithfulness that gets celebrated. The dramatic kind. The visible kind. The kind that has a moment you can point to and say, there. That is when everything changed. The burning bush, the still small voice after the fire and the earthquake, the road to Damascus and the blinding light. These are the stories we remember because they have shape, because they have a before and an after, because the transformation is so complete and so sudden that it carries the quality of a story well told. Enoch's faithfulness was not that kind. There is no single moment recorded where Enoch heard a voice from heaven and turned his life in a new direction. No crisis that drove him to his knees and produced a conversion. No dramatic before and after. Just a man who walked, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, in the direction of the one who made him. Through a world that was moving with increasing speed in the opposite direction. 300 years. Sit with that number for a moment and let it become real rather than abstract. 300 years is longer than the entire history of the United States as a nation. It spans more generations than most family trees can trace. It is longer than the gap between Shakespeare and today. 300 years of choosing every morning. In every season, in every kind of weather, the soul produces. The bright mornings and the gray ones. The years when the presence felt close, and the years when the silence was so long, it could have been mistaken for absence. To walk toward God rather than away. The Hebrew word the text uses for this walking is hithalic. It is worth understanding what that word actually means, because most translations flatten it in ways that cost something important. Hithalic is a reflexive, repeated form of the verb to walk. It doesn't describe a single journey. It doesn't even describe a habit. Exactly. It describes something more like a continuous rhythm, a back and forth, an ongoing movement between two presences that has become so established, so foundational, that it is less a decision made each morning and more a way of being in the world. Two people who walk together long enough stop thinking about walking together. They simply walk. The rhythm of it has become their rhythm. This is what Genesis is describing when it says, Enoch walked with God. Not a spiritual discipline maintained with gritted teeth. A relationship grown so deep over so long that the walking had become inseparable from the man himself. But that kind of depth doesn't arrive. It accumulates, and accumulation requires something that our current cultural moment is profoundly suspicious of. It requires ordinary days, unremarkable mornings, the willingness to show up when nothing dramatic is happening, when no vision is being granted, when the sky above the hillside looks exactly like it looked yesterday and the day before. The willingness to be faithful in the small when the large has not yet arrived. Picture Enoch at 40 years into his walk with God. The world around him is drifting. The line of Seth is intermarrying with the line of Cain. The values are blurring. The violence is increasing in small increments that make each individual increase seem tolerable, while the accumulated total becomes monstrous. He is one man on a hillside, with a hunger that his neighbors stopped being able to understand years ago. He has no Book of Enoch yet. He has no visions of the throne room. No tour of the astronomical heavens. No revelation of the Son of Man. He has what every person who has ever tried to walk with God has: the ordinary day, the quiet, the choice to show up in the presence of the one he cannot see, toward the one whose voice he cannot always hear, for reasons that the world around him increasingly cannot understand and increasingly does not respect. Now picture him at 150 years. The watchers have descended. The world is changing in ways that go beyond ordinary moral decline. Something ancient and powerful and deeply wrong is moving through the culture. Enoch can feel it. The way a physician feels the presence of something dangerous before the symptoms have a name. He cannot fix it. He cannot stop it. He can only keep walking. And at 250 years, the world is full of the consequences. The Nephilim are real. The violence is catastrophic. The forbidden knowledge has been absorbed so completely that entire generations have grown up inside it as though it were simply the nature of things. The gap between what the world was created to be and what it has become is so wide that ordinary repair cannot bridge it. And Enoch walks. This is the detail that most retellings of the Book of Enoch either miss or rush past, because it is less dramatic than fallen angels and less spectacular than throne rooms. But it is the foundation on which every spectacular thing in this ancient text rests. Without those 300 ordinary years, there are no visions. Without the daily choice to keep the rhythm when nothing extraordinary is happening, there is no transparency for the extraordinary to pour through. The visions did not create the man. The man, built slowly over 3 centuries of faithful, unremarkable walking, became the kind of vessel through which the visions could move. And here is what that means for the night you are in. Most of us have been waiting, at some level, for the dramatic version of faithfulness, the moment of clarity, the unmistakable voice, the burning bush that makes the direction obvious, and the commitment feel effortless. And when that moment doesn't come, When the morning prayer feels like speaking into a ceiling. When the silence is longer than feels tolerable. When the world around us is dark in ways we didn't cause and cannot fix. We interpret that ordinariness as evidence of spiritual failure. Enoch's 300 years say otherwise. The ordinariness is not the absence of the walk. The ordinariness is the walk. The mornings when nothing happens. When you show up anyway. When you choose the direction of God over the direction of the drift. Not because it feels powerful, but because the hunger in you, that specific ache that the world cannot satisfy, refuses to be quieted by anything less. Those mornings are the foundation. Those mornings are what 3 centuries of Ethiopic is made of. One unremarkable day at a time. Something else is worth saying about those 300 years. Enoch was not walking alone in the abstract sense. He was walking through a specific, deteriorating, increasingly dangerous world, surrounded by people who had largely given up on the direction he was moving. That kind of faithfulness is not peaceful. It is lonely in ways that have texture. It cost something real, and it produced something real. A transparency so complete that when God needed to show a human being the structure of heaven, the chambers of the dead, the face of the hidden Son of Man, there was a man whose long faithfulness had made him ready to receive it without being destroyed by it. 300 years of ordinary mornings. That was Enoch's greatness. That, and nothing more spectacular than that, is what opened the heavens, long before the first human being drew breath. Before the oceans filled their basins and the mountains found their heights, God made the angels. Not a handful, not a symbolic few. Scripture speaks of tens of thousands. Innumerable hosts of beings, crafted with intelligence and power and purpose, each one reflecting a different aspect of the glory that made them. Some stood before the throne in continuous worship. Some carried messages across the distances between heaven and earth. Some governed the movements of stars, the paths of winds, the turning of seasons, maintaining the invisible architecture that holds the visible world together. And some were given the assignment that would become the center of everything that follows. They were called the Watchers. The name itself contains the assignment, being sent to observe, to stand as witnesses to the unfolding of human history, to care from a distance for the fragile and beloved creatures God had placed on the earth. The Book of Enoch describes them as holy angels, chosen from the higher ranks of heaven, beings of extraordinary capacity and clarity, given a post at the boundary between the divine and the human, close enough to see, far enough to remain what they were. That distance was not incidental. It was the assignment. They were watchers, not participants, not companions, not equals to the humans they observed. The boundary between their nature and human nature was not a limitation to be overcome. It was the shape of their calling. But watching is a dangerous assignment when it becomes longing. The Book of Enoch records what happened next with a precision that feels almost forensic. Among the watchers, something shifted. They began to notice the daughters of men, and something stirred in them that their nature had never been designed to hold. Not admiration exactly. Not simply appreciation for the beauty of what God had made. Something more possessive than that. Something that reached across the boundary. Their assignment required them to maintain and kept reaching. 200 of them gathered. The text places this gathering at the summit of Mount Hermon, a peak standing nearly 9,000 feet above the valley floor, in the border region between what is now Syria and Lebanon. A place where the thinness of the air and the distance from the ordinary world below creates the feeling that heaven and earth are separated by less than usual. A place chosen, perhaps, because the closeness to heaven made what they were about to swear feel more binding. And this is where the Book of Enoch does something that most ancient texts don't do. It slows down and shows us the interior of the moment before the choice is made. Because Semyaza, their leader, understood exactly what they were contemplating. Before a single step was taken, before a single oath was sworn, he said to the others words that deserve to be heard slowly. I fear you will not agree to do this thing. And I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. Read that again, and let its weight settle. Semyaza was not confused. He was not deceived. He was not operating under some misunderstanding about the nature of what they were planning. He knew the boundary. He knew the consequence. He knew that what they were about to do was wrong. Not ambiguously wrong. Not wrong in some interpretations. But categorically, clearly, irreversibly wrong. And his concern was not that the action was wrong. His concern was that he might end up bearing the punishment alone. This is one of the most chilling moments in all of ancient literature, precisely because of how recognizable it is. The person who says, "I'll do this terrible thing as long as everyone else is doing it with me," is not a figure from mythology. That voice is in every boardroom where something unconscionable gets approved, because no one wants to be the only one who said no. That voice is in every friendship group, where cruelty becomes normalized, because the cost of objecting seems higher than the cost of going along. That voice is a king to human heart, in moments we would rather not examine too closely. The others answered by swearing a mutual oath. All 200 of them. Binding themselves together, so that if punishment came, it would come to all of them equally. No one could turn back. No one could later claim they had reservations. The oath sealed them to each other and to the choice, making the way forward the only way available. They descended. Now here, honest reading requires a pause. The interpretation of Genesis 6, the passage that underlies this section of the Book of Enoch, has been genuinely debated among serious scholars and theologians for centuries. Some read the sons of God as literal, heavenly beings, finding support in the letters of Jude and Peter. And in this ancient text, others understand them as the line of Seth, or as earthly rulers whose power had corrupted their self-understanding. These are real and ongoing conversations among people of genuine faith and genuine scholarship. What the Book of Enoch offers is one ancient tradition's account, vivid, specific, and enormously influential on how the earliest followers of Jesus understood the world they lived in. We walk through it as testimony, as one of the oldest voices in the biblical tradition, speaking about events that shaped everything that followed. With that held carefully, let us continue. The Book of Enoch names 20 chief leaders among the 200. The names are not decoration. They carry meaning embedded in their very syllables. Semyaza, whose name connects to the concept of seeing the name, of looking at what God had made and wanting it for himself. Azazel, whose name scholars have connected to the concept of removal and the wilderness, a name that would echo through Israelite religious practice in ways we will examine more closely in the next chapter. What strikes most powerfully about the descent is not its drama but its deliberateness. These were not impulsive beings, overwhelmed by a feeling they couldn't control. They were highly intelligent, cosmically experienced beings who had stood in the presence of holiness, who knew the structure of creation from the inside, who understood with a clarity that no human being fully possesses exactly what they were choosing and exactly what it would cost. And they chose it anyway. This is the anti-Enoch. This is the equal and opposite of everything his 300 years represented. Where Enoch, a finite, limited, mortal human being with every reason to drift, chose every morning to walk toward God. These beings, with vastly greater knowledge and vastly greater capacity, chose with full information to walk away. The contrast is not subtle. The Book of Enoch places it at the center of its moral architecture deliberately. The question it poses is one that cuts through every century between Semyaza's oath and tonight. Knowledge does not produce faithfulness. Power does not produce wisdom. The capacity to understand what is right does not guarantee the will to choose it. The Watchers knew more than Enoch could dream of knowing, and they chose the oath on the mountain. Enoch knew only this, that the hunger in him would not settle for anything less than the one who made him. That difference, and nothing more spectacular than that, is what separated the man who was taken alive from the earth from the beings who were sealed under it. Not all destruction arrives wearing the face of destruction. Some of the most catastrophic damage ever done to the human world arrived wearing the face of gift, wrapped in the language of empowerment, of enlightenment, of giving people access to things they had been unfairly denied. The most dangerous corruptions in history have rarely announced themselves as corruptions. They announce themselves as revelations. Azazel understood this perfectly. Among the 200 watchers who descended, the Book of Enoch draws a careful distinction between two kinds of transgression. Semyaza's sin was the crossing of a physical boundary, the taking of human wives, the union between heaven and earth that was never designed or intended. It was catastrophic in its consequences. But it was a single category of wrong, the violation of a limit. Azazel's sin was different in kind, deeper in reach, more difficult to undo. Because Azazel did not simply cross a boundary, he dismantled one from the inside, systematically, with the patient precision of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and why it would work. Azazel taught. The Book of Enoch is specific about what he taught. And the specificity matters enormously because it prevents us from reading this as a vague moral fable about knowledge being dangerous. This is not an ancient version of ignorance is bliss. What the text describes is something far more precise and far more troubling. He taught men to make swords, not the crude weapons that human ingenuity might eventually have developed independently, but sophisticated instruments of killing. The metallurgical knowledge required to extract metals from the earth, to shape them with heat and skill into blades capable of ending life with an efficiency that changed the scale of violence permanently. Before this knowledge, conflict was limited by the limits of human bodies. After it, the only limit was supply. He taught the making of shields and breastplates, not just how to attack, but how to make the attacker invulnerable. How to create asymmetries of power, so complete that the strong could move through the world as though the weak simply did not exist as a moral category. He taught the arts of ornamentation, the use of precious metals and stones to adorn the body, which sounds harmless until the Book of Enoch specifies what it produced: the weaponization of beauty, the transformation of physical appearance from something enjoyed into something deployed, the techniques of seduction. The text says, the use of what is genuinely beautiful to manipulate, to create desire as a mechanism of control. He revealed the reading of omens and the arts of sorcery, the reaching into spiritual forces through methods that bypassed the relationship with the Creator that would have made such reaching safe. The sky, which Uriel would later show Enoch as testimony to divine faithfulness, was taught instead as a system of prediction and power. The heavens that declared the glory of God were reframed as a resource to be mined for advantage. The Book of Enoch makes a claim about all of this that deserves to be heard as argument rather than simply as condemnation. When God instructs the archangel Raphael concerning Azazel, the words recorded in this ancient text are striking in their scope. The whole earth has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel. Not part of the earth, not certain communities or certain generations. The whole earth, meaning the corruption introduced by his teaching, spread with the comprehensiveness of something woven into the fabric of how the world now operated. But here is the insight that most retellings miss entirely, and it is the one that makes Azazel's transgression genuinely theological rather than merely dramatic. Every single thing the Book of Enoch says Azazel taught was a distortion of something real and good. Metallurgy is not evil. The working of metal is one of the great capacities of human creativity. It built cathedrals and surgical instruments and the infrastructure of every civilization that has ever sheltered human life from the cold. The study of the heavens is not evil. It is the foundation of navigation, of agriculture, of the understanding of seasons that allowed human communities to survive. The appreciation of beauty is not evil. It is one of the clearest echoes of the divine in the human soul. The capacity to recognize and respond to what is lovely as a form of worship. What Azazel introduced was not alien. It was not foreign matter injected into a pure system. It was the real thing, offered at the wrong time, in the wrong way. outside the relationship that would have made it safe to hold. This is the oldest pattern of temptation in the record of human experience. Not the invention of something evil, but the premature offering of something true. Power handed to beings who lacked the wisdom to use it rightly. Knowledge separated from the conscience, and the relationship with the Creator that give knowledge its proper shape. The fruit that was genuinely good for food, and genuinely pleasant to the eyes, and genuinely able to make one wise. Offered outside, the only context in which eating it would not destroy everything. Azazel's gift was real. That is precisely what made it so devastating. Think about what happened in the generations after his teaching spread. The metallurgical knowledge that could have been developed slowly, organically, within communities whose moral and spiritual frameworks were growing alongside their technical capacity, arrived instead, all at once, in a world that had no framework to hold it. Weapons that should have taken centuries of incremental development to produce were suddenly available in a world already trending toward violence. The line of Cain had already produced Lamech's boast, already normalized the celebration of cruelty. Now it had tools. The result was not simply more violence. It was violence of a different order. Systematic, efficient, operating at a scale that individual cruelty, without these tools, could never have reached. The Book of Enoch describes the earth filling with bloodshed in a way that suggests not scattered conflict, but something approaching the elimination of any space where ordinary human life could continue safely. And alongside the weapons, the other teachings were spreading with equal comprehensiveness. The use of beauty as manipulation reshaped the social fabric. The reaching into spiritual forces through sorcery opened dimensions of influence that corrupted communities from the inside, without the communities being able to identify the source of what was wrong. The reading of omens replaced the relationship with the Creator with a system of extraction. Instead of asking the God who governs the heavens what he was saying, people learned to read the heavens as a mechanism and use what they read for their own purposes. Knowledge extracted from relationship becomes a tool, and tools serve whoever holds them most effectively, regardless of what the holding costs. The earth was filling with the consequences of a gift given without the relationship that would have made it safe. And at the center of it, Azazel, whose name would echo through the most solemn religious ceremony of ancient Israel, whose memory was preserved in the scapegoat ritual of Leviticus with the precision of something too dangerous to forget. Continued teaching. The world Enoch was walking through every morning was not simply morally declining. It had been structurally altered. The very fabric of how human beings related to knowledge, to power, to beauty, to the spiritual world. All of it had been rewired by a being who understood human nature well enough to know exactly which gifts would be most completely corrupting. The hunger that Azazel's teaching created could not be satisfied by anything Azazel's teaching provided. That is the final cruelty of his gift. It made people want more of the very thing that was destroying them. The weapons created the need for more weapons. The manipulation created the need for more manipulation. The sorcery opened doors that demanded more doors be opened. Only the removal of the source could begin to address the wound. And that removal was coming, in the form of a healer, sent with precise instructions to bind Azazel hand and foot in a desert place and cover his face so he could not see the light. The healer's name was Raphael, and he was already on his way. There is a moment in every disaster when the consequences outgrow the people who caused them, when what has been set in motion develops its own momentum, its own appetite, its own logic, and the beings who started it discover they no longer control what they created. For the world before the flood, that moment arrived with the birth of the Nephilim. The word appears in your Bible. Genesis 6:4. Plain, brief, almost casual in its delivery. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. 4 words in Hebrew, centuries of debate about what they actually were. The word Nephilim comes from a root carrying the idea of falling. Some translate it as the fallen ones. Others render it those who cause others to fall. The oldest Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, the version most New Testament writers quoted when they cited Scripture, renders it simply as giants. The Book of Enoch does not leave the question open. According to this ancient text, the Nephilim were the offspring of the union between the Watchers and the daughters of men, hybrid beings who belonged completely to neither world and were constrained by neither world's limitations. Honest reading requires acknowledging what careful scholarship requires us to say here. The nature and identity of the Nephilim has been interpreted very differently across Jewish and Christian traditions, and that diversity is real and significant. Some read the language of this text as describing literal beings of extraordinary physical scale. Others understand it as communicating moral and spiritual enormity rather than physical size. Beings whose destructive capacity was vast, without necessarily implying unusual stature. The Book of Enoch presents the most vivid and specific account among ancient sources. We walk through it as one ancient tradition's testimony, held with the care that honest engagement requires. With that said, the picture this ancient text paints is unflinching. The Nephilim had a need that the earth could not satisfy, not a hunger that could be managed or redirected or gradually filled, a consuming, insatiable appetite that operated without the natural limits that govern ordinary creatures. They consumed everything humanity had produced. When that was gone, they turned to the animals. When the animals were exhausted, they turned on human beings themselves. And then, in the detail, the Book of Enoch records without softening, they turned on each other. The earth became a place of unceasing violence, not the ordinary violence of human conflict, terrible as that already was, but something of an entirely different order. A systematic consumption that left nothing untouched, recognized no boundary, acknowledged no claim of the weak against the strong. Every social structure that human communities had developed to protect the vulnerable, every unspoken rule about what you don't do to your neighbor, every fragile agreement that made cooperative life possible, was simply irrelevant to beings whose existence the existing moral framework had no category for. And alongside this physical devastation, the forbidden knowledge Azazel had introduced was spreading through the human world with the efficiency of something designed to spread. Each generation absorbed it more completely than the last. What had shocked the first generation became normal for the second, foundational for the third. Children grew up inside the consequences of Azazel's teaching, the way children grow up inside any cultural reality, not choosing it, simply inheriting it as the shape of the world. Weapons were normal. The manipulation of beauty was normal. The reaching into spiritual forces through sorcery was normal. The reading of the heavens as a system of extraction, rather than a testimony of faithfulness, was normal. The entire framework through which the pre-flood world understood power, knowledge, and spiritual reality had been quietly, comprehensively replaced, and most people living inside it had no memory of what it had replaced. This is the detail that makes the pre-flood world genuinely tragic, rather than simply wicked. The people born into it did not choose Azazel's curriculum. They arrived into a world already shaped by it, already running on its logic, already breathing its assumptions. The violence was not a series of individual decisions. It was a culture, and cultures are inherited before they are chosen. The Book of Enoch also records something about the aftermath of the Nephilim that most retellings pass over entirely, and it is one of the most theologically significant claims in the entire text. According to this ancient account, when the Nephilim perished, evil spirits proceeded from their bodies, spirits that would continue to afflict the children of men long after the physical crisis had ended. The text presents this as part of its explanation for why spiritual oppression did not simply conclude when the flood washed the earth clean. This is a claim that has been held very differently across the centuries of theological reflection. Some receive it as a literal account of how certain spiritual forces entered the world and persist within it. Others understand it as a framework, a way of articulating the reality that corruption, once introduced into a system at sufficient depth, leaves traces that outlast the original source. That the damage done by Azazel's teaching and the Nephilim's violence did not simply evaporate when the beings responsible were removed. It had become embedded in the world itself. What is undeniable, on either reading, is the point the Book of Enoch is pressing. The consequences of what the Watchers set in motion could not be entirely contained even by the flood that was coming. The cleaning of the earth would be real and necessary and profound. But the deeper problem, the problem of a human nature that had been shaped by centuries of corrupted knowledge and unchecked appetite, would require something more than water. The earth was groaning. That is not a metaphor in this ancient text. It is almost a technical term. The creation itself was responding to what had been done within it. The souls of those who had suffered, the voices of the innocent ground down by what the Watchers had unleashed, were rising upward through the corruption towards something the corruption could not reach. The threshold of heaven, the place where the crying arrives, the place where four beings of extraordinary power and clarity were standing, watching the catastrophe below, and carrying what they witnessed to the highest place. The earth cried out, and the throne heard. There is something the human soul knows even when the mind cannot confirm it. It knows that crying out matters. It knows that suffering witnessed is not the same as suffering unseen. It knows there is a difference, sometimes a desperate, life-sustaining difference, between pain endured in complete silence and pain that has been heard by someone with the power to respond. Every person who has ever prayed in the dark knows this instinctively. The prayer goes up and you wait. The waiting is its own kind of suffering. And the question underneath the waiting is the oldest question there is. Is anyone there? And if they are there, do they hear? And if they hear, will they respond? The Book of Enoch answers that question, not with philosophy, not with argument, with a scene. The cries of the earth rose upward. The souls of those who had suffered at the hands of what the Watchers had set in motion sent their petition through whatever distance separates the world of the living from the presence of the eternal. And the Book of Enoch says, without hesitation, that they arrived. They arrived before four beings of extraordinary power and clarity: Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, the four archangels named in this ancient tradition, and they appear here not as decorative figures or soft-winged creatures of popular imagination, but as fully realized personalities with distinct characters, distinct roles, and distinct responses to what they are witnessing. Let us meet each one, because understanding who they are changes everything about how you hear what they do. Michael, his name in Hebrew is itself a question and a declaration simultaneously. Who is like God? He is the commander, associated throughout Scripture with righteous confrontation and the protection of God's people. In the book of Daniel, he appears as the great prince who stands guard over Israel. In the letter of Jude, he disputes with the adversary. In Revelation, he leads the armies of heaven. Michael is the archangel of standing firm when the ground is contested. The one you send when what is required is not persuasion or healing, but the confrontation of something that has chosen wrongness with full knowledge and must now be met on its own terms. Gabriel, his name means something close to God is my strength. He is the messenger, the communicator, the one who stands at the intersection between the divine plan and human understanding. In Daniel, he comes to explain visions that would otherwise remain sealed. In the Gospel of Luke, he announces to a young woman in Nazareth that she will carry the Son of God into the world. Gabriel is the archangel of translation, taking what heaven intends and rendering it in words that human ears can actually receive. He moves between worlds, not with force, but with language. And language in his hands is not merely communication, it is transformation. Raphael, his name means God heals. He is the archangel of restoration, of the mending of what has been broken. In the book of Tobit, he guides a young man through danger, heals a father's blindness, drives away a tormenting spirit, moving through the human world with the specific intention of making broken things whole again. Raphael does not confront wrongness by overpowering it. He addresses the wound it left behind. He is the one sent not to fight the disease, but to heal the patient, to restore what corruption damaged, and return to wholeness, what violence unmade. Uriel. His name means God is my light. He is associated in this text with illumination, with the revealing of what darkness has hidden, and the restoration of clarity to minds that have been confused by the noise of the world. In the Book of Enoch, he becomes Enoch's guide through the astronomical visions, showing him the paths of the stars and the structure of time itself. Uriel is the one who helps you see what is actually there when the darkness has made everything look the same shade of gray. 4 personalities, 4 functions, 4 witnesses now standing at the boundary between heaven and earth, watching the catastrophe below, carrying what they have seen to the highest place. The Book of Enoch records what they said to God when they arrived, and it deserves to be heard slowly, because it is one of the most remarkable prayers in all of ancient literature. They said, "You know all things before they come to existence, and you see these things, and you suffer them, and you do not tell us what we ought to do regarding them." Read that again, and let its full weight arrive. They are not filing a report. They are not delivering a neutral briefing. They are doing something far more intimate and far more honest than either of those things. They are bringing their confusion, their distress, their urgent helplessness directly to the Creator of everything, and they are asking why He has allowed this without telling them what to do about it. They are wrestling with the gap between what they know about God's character and what they are watching happen on the earth below, and God does not rebuke them for asking. He answers. This is where the theology of the Book of Enoch becomes most profound and most personally relevant, because God's response reveals something essential about the nature of divine patience, something that touches the oldest human question about why suffering is permitted before intervention comes. God knew. He always knew. He knew what the Watchers had chosen before they swore their oath on Mount Hermon. He knew the name of every soul whose cry had risen from the corrupted earth. He knew the full scope of what Azazel had taught and what the Nephilim had done. The Book of Enoch stands with all of Scripture in insisting on this with complete clarity. God is not surprised by evil. He is not watching the chaos below and improvising responses. He is not a distracted administrator who missed the memo. He is waiting for the moment that is precisely right. And when that moment arrives, He does not respond with a general intervention. He responds with surgical precision, sending exactly the right being to address exactly the right dimension of exactly the right problem. To Raphael the healer, He gave instructions regarding Azazel, the source of corrupted knowledge, the one whose teaching had wounded the earth most deeply. Who better to address a wound than a healer? To Gabriel the communicator, He gave instructions regarding the offspring of the Watchers, beings who understood only force and appetite. Who better to address them than the one whose gift is the precise use of language to accomplish what weapons cannot? To Michael the commander, He gave instructions regarding Semyaza and the chief Watchers, beings who had rebelled with full knowledge and deliberate intent, who required not healing but confrontation. Who better than the one whose entire nature is the righteous facing down of unrighteous power? And this is the detail that stops everything and demands to be held separately. God spoke words that stand as some of the most quietly extraordinary in the entire text. In the middle of the worst crisis this ancient account describes, at the precise moment, He is issuing instructions to address fallen angels and their catastrophic consequences. God announces the ending, not the middle, the ending. A time is coming, He says, of peace and righteousness that will last forever. From where He stands, the ending is as certain as the beginning. The crisis below is real. The suffering is real. The intervention being dispatched is real and necessary. And none of it changes where the story is going. Because where the story is going was decided before the Watchers swore their oath or the Nephilim drew their first breath. The crying reached heaven. The throne responded with precision. And the ending was spoken aloud before the middle was resolved. Let that be enough for tonight. The prayer that rises from the dark is not dissolving into silence. It is arriving. The way the cries of the pre-flood earth arrived before four beings, who carried them immediately to the one who had already prepared the answer before the question was fully formed. Your particular darkness tonight is known. Your particular crying has a destination, and the one who receives it has already seen the ending from where he stands. Precision is one of the most underappreciated qualities of the divine. We tend to imagine heavenly intervention in grand, sweeping terms: light flooding darkness, power overwhelming chaos, a single enormous act that resolves everything simultaneously. But the response of heaven to the crisis of the pre-flood world, as the Book of Enoch records it, looks nothing like that. It looks instead like the work of a surgeon who has studied the patient for a very long time and knows exactly where to cut. 4 archangels, 4 assignments, each one matched with the specific care of someone who understands not just the problem, but the nature of the one being sent to address it. Raphael went to Azazel first. There is no great battle described, no dramatic clash of cosmic powers lighting up the sky. The Book of Enoch records this confrontation with almost clinical simplicity, the kind of simplicity that communicates not the absence of power, but the complete sufficiency of it. Raphael binds Azazel hand and foot. He casts him into darkness in a desert place. He covers him with rough and jagged rocks, and covers his face so that he cannot see the light. And he declares over him that the whole earth has been corrupted through his teachings, and that he will remain in this darkness until the great day of judgment, when he will be cast into fire permanently. No struggle recorded, no resistance that required effort to overcome, just the healer arriving at the source of the wound and removing it with the quiet efficiency of someone who has never doubted the outcome. But here is the detail that most people pass over entirely, and it is one of the most theologically significant connections in the entire text. The desert place where Azazel is bound carries a name in ancient Jewish interpretation that links it directly to the most solemn ceremony in the Israelite religious calendar. Every year on the Day of Atonement, the holiest day, the day when the high priest entered the inner sanctuary and the people stood in the weight of everything they had done and failed to do. 2 goats were brought forward. One was sacrificed. The other had the sins of the entire people symbolically laid upon it by the high priest's hands, and it was sent away into the wilderness. The Hebrew text of Leviticus calls the destination of that second goat Azazel. The name in the Book of Enoch and the destination in Leviticus are the same word. What this tells us is extraordinary. The memory of Azazel, of this being who corrupted the earth with premature and weaponized knowledge, was preserved in the most sacred annual ceremony of ancient Israel. Every year, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest enacted a ritual that pointed back toward this ancient tradition. The sins of the people were sent away into the wilderness, to the place associated with the one who had first introduced them. The scapegoat was not random. It was a theological statement, rehearsed annually, connecting the present burden of human sinfulness to its ancient and catastrophic source. Scholars have debated the full meaning of this connection for centuries, but the connection itself is there in the text, waiting for anyone who reads both passages carefully enough to notice it. Meanwhile, Gabriel moved among the offspring of the Watchers. His assignment was different in method from Raphael's, characteristic of who he is. God had instructed him not to destroy them by direct force, but to turn their own nature against them. Gabriel incited them against each other. And beings who had lived entirely by the logic that strength needs no justification began to consume each other by that same principle. There is a deep and uncomfortable justice embedded in this that is worth sitting with. The Nephilim had operated on a single governing assumption, that the powerful take what they want from whoever cannot stop them. Gabriel simply allowed that assumption to complete its own conclusion. When everything operates by the rule of unchecked appetite, the result is not stability. It is implosion. The strong devour the weak, then turn on each other. Because appetite, without limit, recognizes no boundary, not even the boundary of its own kind. The Book of Enoch is making a philosophical argument inside a narrative here. A world built entirely on power and consumption does not stabilize into a sustainable darkness. It devours itself. The destruction does not require external imposition. It emerges naturally from the internal logic of a system that has no principle of restraint. Gabriel did not need to raise a weapon. He simply removed the last obstacle between the Nephilim and the full consequence of their own nature. Michael received the most complex assignment. Semyaza and the chief watchers were not merely powerful. They were intelligent, deliberate, and bound together by the mutual oath they had sworn on Mount Hermon. Their judgment had to reflect the full weight of what they had chosen with open eyes. Michael bound them for 70 generations under the hills of the earth. The number 70 in ancient Hebrew thought communicates completeness and fullness rather than a precise arithmetical count. 70 elders of Israel, 70 years of Babylonian exile, the 70 weeks of Daniel's prophecy. When the Book of Enoch says 70 generations, it means for the full appointed time, until the moment God has determined is precisely right for the final accounting. Not a day early, not a day late. They are bound, they are sealed, but they are not yet finally judged. And this distinction matters enormously because it is reflected with striking clarity in the New Testament. The letter of Jude, which quotes the Book of Enoch directly by name, says that God kept the angels, who did not stay within their own position of authority, in eternal chains, under gloomy darkness, until the judgment of the great day. The second letter of Peter says, God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into chains to be kept until the judgment. Both letters use present tense. They are currently bound. The final judgment is still coming. The two stages, binding now, final judgment later, are not a theological inconsistency. They are the structure of a justice that is both immediate and complete. Immediate in that the source of active corruption is removed at once. Complete in that the full reckoning waits for the moment when the entire story has unfolded and nothing remains to be accounted for. Now, here is the analysis that most retellings miss entirely. And it is the heart of what makes these 4 assignments more than a story about punishment. Every element of this response is oriented toward healing rather than toward retribution. Azazel is bound so that the source of corrupted knowledge stops flowing into the world. Not because God cannot tolerate his existence, but because the earth cannot survive the continued introduction of power without wisdom. The binding is protective. The removal of a toxin from a system being slowly destroyed by it. The Nephilim are turned against each other, not out of divine indifference to their suffering, but because their continued presence made the survival of any ordinary human life impossible. The judgment is preservative. It makes space for humanity to continue, to breathe, to exist long enough for the restoration that God had already announced. Semyaza and the chief watchers are sealed not simply to punish them, but to prevent the repetition of what they did. The imprisonment is containment, a limiting of the damage to what has already occurred, a closing of the door that their oath had forced open. The judgment of the watchers is not primarily about the watchers. It is primarily about protecting humanity and preserving the possibility of the story continuing toward the ending God had already spoken aloud. And that ending, peace and righteousness, lasting forever, was not a distant hope offered to soften a hard present. It was a certainty declared from the only vantage point from which certainty is possible. The vantage point of the one who stands outside time and sees the whole arc of the story simultaneously, for whom the ending is as present and as real as the beginning. The same precision that sent Raphael to Azazel and Michael to Semyaza is at work in every darkness tonight. The same God who matched the healer to the wound and the commander to the rebellion sees exactly what is required in your particular circumstances. He is not improvising. He is not delayed. He is precise, and his precision is always underneath everything. In the service of healing, there are moments that divide a life into before and after, not because they announce themselves loudly or arrive with warning, but because what happens inside them is so far beyond the ordinary range of human experience that the person who passes through them cannot return to being who they were before. The categories shift. The world looks different from the other side. Something that cannot be unseen has been seen. For Enoch, that moment came on an ordinary night. Not on a mountaintop after weeks of fasting. Not in a desert after years of solitary preparation. The Book of Enoch gives us the location with quiet simplicity. He was at home, in his house, and he was weeping and praying on behalf of the watchers. This detail deserves a full stop before we continue. The watchers, beings who had crossed every boundary, who had sworn their oath with full knowledge, who had set in motion the corruption of the entire earth, had come to Enoch and asked him to carry their petition to God, because they were too ashamed to lift their own voices toward the one they had betrayed. Their transgression had silenced them before the Holy, in a way that all their power and intelligence could not overcome. Shame, it turns out, is a great equalizer, and so they came to a human being, to the one man on earth whose closeness to God made him the only conceivable intermediary. The beings who had looked down at humanity from their post at the boundary of heaven and found human women desirable were now looking up at a human man and finding in him something they had lost and could not recover on their own: access to the presence they had abandoned. Enoch agreed to carry their petition, not because he approved of what they had done, not because mercy required him to minimize the gravity of their choice, but because 300 years of walking beside the most merciful being in existence had shaped him into someone for whom intercession was as natural as breathing. He prayed for people and beings who had no right to expect it. That is what mercy looks like when it has been genuinely internalized rather than merely understood. He fell asleep praying, and the heavens opened. What the Book of Enoch describes next has no real parallel in ancient literature. Enoch is not simply given a dream in the ordinary sense, not a night vision that carries symbolic weight, but remains contained within the familiar architecture of sleeping consciousness. According to this text, he is taken, lifted, transported in a way that he himself struggles to find language for. Because the experience exceeded every category his earthly mind had been built to process. He describes winds that carried him, clouds that lifted him, a movement through dimensions of reality that left the ordinary world below like a lamp left burning in a distant valley. And then, at the outer edge of everything familiar, he encountered something that stopped him completely: a structure of crystal, surrounded by tongues of fire, its walls of crystal, its floor of crystal, its ceiling alive with something between fire and stars woven together, and beyond it, a greater structure still, a second house, larger than the first, whose floor was fire, whose ceiling was fire, whose walls were fire, and at whose threshold Enoch stopped because the cold hit him. This detail has puzzled readers for centuries. Why cold? Why, in an account saturated with fire and light, does the approach to the divine presence register first as cold? A cold so complete that Enoch compares it to snow and ice. The ancient interpreters understood it as the cold of absolute holiness, a purity so total, so far beyond anything the human soul has encountered in the ordinary world. That meeting, it registers not as warmth, but as the shock of contact with something entirely other. Not hostile, not cruel, simply so far beyond the familiar that the contrast between it and everything human experience has prepared you for arrives in the body as something resembling cold. The way a person stepping from a warm room into a clear winter night feels not just temperature but the sudden, clarifying reality of a world much larger than the room they just left. Enoch entered. The throne was beyond language. He does not describe a face. He does not render features the way one describes another person encountered on a road. What he describes is the emanation, the surrounding reality of a presence so immense that approaching it directly is not possible, even in vision. He sees the robe that surrounds the throne. He sees rivers of fire flowing outward from it. He sees the highest orders of angelic beings surrounding it, covering their own faces before what they serve. Not out of fear exactly, but out of the instinctive response of created beings encountering the uncreated at close range. And Enoch falls on his face. This is not a performed gesture of religious etiquette. It is the only possible physical response of a human being in the presence of absolute holiness. Every account in Scripture of a human encountering the divine at close range produces the same response. Isaiah cried out that he was undone. Ezekiel fell on his face. John, on the island of Patmos, fell as though dead. The body understands what the mind cannot fully process and responds the only way available to it. Complete surrender to the gravity of what it is, in the presence of Enoch lies there trembling. And then something happens that is, in its own way, more astonishing than everything he has already witnessed. The great glory speaks. Not through an angel, not through an intermediary, directly, to this trembling human being lying face down on the floor of heaven, unable to look up, overwhelmed past the capacity for composed response. And what does the voice that spoke the universe into existence say to the one man who walked with him for 300 years? Come near. Enoch, hear my word. Come near. 2 words that undo every distance. 2 words that transform the overwhelming terror of absolute holiness into something else entirely. Because the God whose presence makes even the highest angels cover their faces is simultaneously the God who says, "Come near to the trembling human on the floor." The same presence, the same holiness, and that word, come near, crossing every distance, reaching down to where Enoch lies undone, and calling him closer rather than away. An angel raises Enoch to his feet and brings him forward, and God speaks to him at length, telling him that the petition of the watchers will not be granted, that their choice carried a weight proportional to the clarity of their knowledge, that beings who had stood in the full light of heaven and walked away from it carried a different accountability than finite mortal creatures whose nature limits their understanding. He tells Enoch to write everything he has seen and everything he is about to see. Write it down, not for the watchers who sent him, for the generations who will come after, for people living in times that neither Enoch nor anyone around him can yet imagine, for people who will need to know that the suffering of the earth is seen, that creation is governed, that justice is certain, that the crying reaches the throne, for you, lying in the dark tonight. This is the commission at the heart of the entire Book of Enoch. A man too overwhelmed to stand, raised to his feet by an angel, brought near by a voice that chose nearness over distance, and then sent back with a message for every generation that would ever need to know that the throne behind the silence is real, and occupied, and paying attention. Come near. Those words were spoken once in a house of fire above the ancient world. They have not been withdrawn. Not in 300 years of Enoch's walking, not in the flood, not in 15 centuries of Ethiopian monasteries. Not tonight. Come near. Hear my word. There is a particular kind of comfort that does not come from being told that everything is fine. It comes instead from being shown that everything is held, that the chaos you are living inside has edges you cannot see from where you are standing, that the darkness pressing in from every direction does not extend infinitely in every direction, that somewhere beyond the visible boundary of what you can perceive, there is structure, deliberate, maintained, governed by something that has not lost track of a single detail. This is what Enoch's extended journeys through heaven were designed to produce. Not entertainment, not the satisfaction of cosmic curiosity, a specific, grounded, unshakable confidence that the world, in all its layers, visible and invisible, living and dead, astronomical and intimate, is held, after the audience, before the great glory, after the commission to write. Enoch did not return immediately to the earth. He was taken further. The Book of Enoch records multiple journeys, multiple layers of revelation, each one adding depth and texture to the picture of a reality far more structured and far more carefully governed than the surface of ordinary life suggests. He was taken first to see what this ancient text calls the treasuries of the winds. Picture that phrase for a moment before moving past it. Treasuries, not simply sources, not mechanisms, but treasuries. The word implies something gathered, something stored, something administered with the care that one gives to what is genuinely valuable. The winds of the earth, in the vision Enoch receives, are not random atmospheric phenomena generated by pressure differentials and temperature gradients moving through indifferent physics. They are kept, held in specific places, released according to specific instructions given to specific beings whose entire function is the faithful administration of something the earth depends on. At each location he visits, he sees beings whose assignment is precisely this: to release these forces according to the instructions they have been given, in the measure and the timing that the governance of the created order requires, not autonomously, not arbitrarily, according to a design whose precision reflects the character of the one who designed it. He sees the treasuries of snow and frost, the chambers from which hail and lightning come, each one administered, each one governed. What we experience standing outside in the first snow of winter, or watching lightning move across a dark sky, or feeling the particular quality of frost on a still morning. All of it, according to this vision, is the surface expression of something being carefully and continuously administered, far below the level of what ordinary human perception can reach. The natural world is not an accident running on its own momentum. It is a governed reality. This is the theological claim Enoch is being shown in geographical, almost architectural terms, as if God is walking him through the building itself, room by room, so that when Enoch returns to the earth and stands under the open sky, he will never be able to look at it again as mere weather. Then Enoch was taken to see the ends of the earth, to places where mountains of metal and fire stand at the boundaries of the known world, to valleys so deep their bottoms cannot be perceived from the edge. And in these valleys, separated from each other by rock and silence and distance, he saw 4 hollow places in the earth. These are the dwelling places of the dead. This passage is one of the most striking in the entire Book of Enoch, and it deserves the full weight of careful attention, because what Enoch is shown suggests that the dead are not simply gone, not dissolved back into the elements, not extinguished, not simply absent in the way that a flame is absent after it is blown out. They are kept, held in these 4 separate places according to the nature of their lives and the circumstances of their deaths, waiting. The first hollow place holds the spirits of the righteous, and this place is described as bright, with a spring of water flowing through it. These are the souls of the faithful, those who lived in the hunger for God that Enoch himself embodied, now held in light and in the specific comfort of being known and remembered. The other places hold different categories of the dead, those who suffered violence and whose cause has not yet been addressed, those who were prosperous and indifferent, those whose choices place them in a different relationship to the coming judgment. Each category separate, each one held with the precision of a justice that has not forgotten a single name, or a single act, or a single moment of suffering endured without acknowledgement. Enoch asks a question that is as human as any question in this ancient text. He looks at the bright place where the righteous are held, and he asks, why must they wait? If their lives were faithful, if their cause is just, if their hunger for God was real and sustained and costly, why are they not already in the fullness of what their faithfulness was moving toward? The angel's answer is one of the most important passages in the Book of Enoch. They must wait, he says, until the day of judgment, until the full reckoning takes place, until the entire arc of the story arrives at its intended end. Because God is not running a series of disconnected transactions. He is telling one story, and the full restoration of all things, the complete, irreversible, nothing left out restoration, requires the fullness of time to unfold before it can be enacted completely. A partial restoration is not the goal, a restoration that leaves anything unaddressed, anyone unaccounted for, any injustice unresolved. That is not the ending God announced to the archangels. The ending he announced was total peace and righteousness lasting forever, and total requires waiting for the moment when total is possible. What looks like delay from inside the story is from outside it. The careful unfolding of something that refuses to be rushed because it cannot afford to be incomplete. This answer reaches into the oldest human complaint about divine timing. Why does God not simply fix everything now? Why does the righteous person suffer while the resolution waits? Why are the souls in the bright place not already in the fullness of their reward? Because the fullness of the reward is not a private transaction between God and an individual soul. It is the restoration of everything, the entire created order. Every relationship, every wrong answered, every tear understood. That restoration cannot be partial. And partial is what now would mean if now came before the story was complete. Justice is not delayed. It is held. Carefully. Precisely. With the attention of someone who has not forgotten a single detail. Until the moment when it can be enacted, not in part, but wholly. Enoch returned from these journeys carrying something that no amount of theological argument could have produced. Not a doctrine about the afterlife. Not a philosophical position on divine justice. A memory. The specific. Visual. Architectural memory of 4 hollow places in the earth, where the dead are kept with the care of someone who has never lost anything they were given to hold. Whatever you are carrying tonight, whatever remains unresolved, whatever injustice has gone unanswered, whatever grief has found no closure, it has not slipped past the governance of the one who keeps the winds in treasuries and holds the dead in light. The hollow places Enoch saw were not prisons. They were waiting rooms, and the one who designed them knows exactly when the waiting ends. There is a moment. If you have ever stood outside on a truly clear night, far from any city, when the sky does something to you that nothing else can quite replicate, it stops you, mid-thought, mid-breath, mid-whatever you were carrying from the day, and for a moment that is somehow both very brief and very long. You are simply standing there, looking up at something so vast and so ordered and so quietly magnificent that the noise inside you goes still. Most of us live our entire lives without stopping to ask what that stillness is. Enoch stopped. He asked, and what he received in answer is one of the most overlooked and most quietly beautiful sections of the entire Book of Enoch. A section called the Astronomical Book, which begins with a single angel and a single invitation. The angel's name was Uriel, the fire of God, the light of heaven, and he came to Enoch not with visions of fallen angels or tours of the chambers of the dead, but with something that must have felt, in comparison, almost tender. He came to show Enoch how the sky works. "Follow me," Uriel said, "and I will show you everything that governs the lights of heaven." What followed was a revelation covering the movements of the sun and moon, the ordering of the seasons, the paths of the winds, the structure of the year, and the relationship between the visible heavens and the invisible order that lies behind them. Enoch recorded all of it, chapter after chapter of detail that scholars of ancient astronomy have spent generations studying with genuine fascination. But before walking through what he saw, the question worth asking first is the one most people never think to ask. Why would God teach astronomy to a prophet? Why, in the middle of visions of fallen angels and heavenly thrones and the chambers of the dead, does the Book of Enoch give an entire section to the movements of the sun and moon? What does the ordering of the sky have to do with the spiritual crisis of the pre-flood world? What does a calendar have to do with anything that matters? It turns out, everything, because the world before the flood had not only been corrupted morally and spiritually. According to the Book of Enoch, it had been corrupted in its relationship to time itself. Among the many things the Watchers introduced was a distorted use of the heavens. The sorcery and reading of omens that Azazel taught were directly connected to a corrupted relationship with the sky. The stars were no longer read as testimony to the faithfulness of God. They were used as instruments of prediction and manipulation, a system of extraction rather than a language of worship. The heavens, which were made to declare the glory of their Creator, had been turned into a mechanism of power. Uriel came to restore the original meaning. He showed Enoch the sun first, rising and setting through 12 gates on the eastern and western horizons, 6 positioned toward the north and 6 toward the south, moving through them in a precise pattern across the year, the days lengthening as the sun moved through the northern gates in summer, shortening as it moved through the southern gates in winter. Everything governed, everything measured, everything exact to a degree that careful observation over generations could verify. The precision with which the Book of Enoch tracks the movement of the sun across the seasons corresponds to actual astronomical observation. Whoever recorded this was watching the sky carefully over a long period, not with the detachment of scientific measurement, but with the attentiveness of someone reading a letter from someone they love, looking not just at what is there but at what it means. The moon follows a similarly precise course. The Book of Enoch traces the lunar cycle in careful detail, tracking the waxing and waning across its 29.5-day rhythm, the way its light increases and decreases by exact fractions each night, the way it rises and sets through different gates according to the same governing logic as the sun. 2 great lights, both administered, both moving in patterns so consistent and so exact that they can be used to structure time itself. And from these 2 governing lights, Enoch derives a calendar of 364 days divided into 4 seasons of equal length, with an additional day inserted at each seasonal boundary to maintain the alignment between the solar rhythm and the human experience of the turning year. Now, this calendar is one of the most historically significant details in the entire Book of Enoch, and the significance was confirmed dramatically in 1947, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the caves near Qumran. Among the most remarkable findings was evidence that the community living there organized their entire communal life around a specific calendar, and that calendar was the calendar of the Book of Enoch. They rejected the lunar calendar being used in the Jerusalem temple, which they considered a later corruption of the original ordering of time. In its place, they used the solar calendar that Enoch had recorded, structuring their feasts, their prayers, their days of rest, their entire rhythm of communal existence around the pattern Uriel had shown. These were not credulous people. They were among the most rigorous scripture scholars of the ancient world, the community that produced some of the most careful copies of biblical texts ever found. They took Enoch's calendar seriously enough to build their entire religious life around it, because they understood something that is easy to miss from a distance of 2,000 years. The calendar is not administrative. The calendar is theological, the ordering of time, the structuring of the year into seasons and feast days and days of rest, was not designed to help ancient people keep appointments. It was designed to keep them oriented, to prevent the drift, to give them a framework within which the story of God and humanity could be remembered and inhabited and handed down intact. Every feast day was a memory rehearsed. Every Sabbath was a declaration made. Every new moon was a witness reenacted. When that ordering is lost, when time becomes merely functional, a series of units to be filled and spent rather than a rhythm to be inhabited, something essential goes with it. The year becomes a cycle of obligation rather than a journey with God. Days become resources rather than gifts. The sky stops speaking because no one is listening for what it says. Uriel was teaching Enoch how to listen again, how to read the sky the way it was always meant to be read, not as a system of prediction or a mechanism of power, but as the most consistent and most publicly visible testimony to the character of the one who set it in motion. Psalm 100, written centuries after Enoch by a king who clearly knew the same God, says it this way: "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge." The sky is always speaking, in every language and in no language, continuously, without pause, and what it is saying, in the precise movement of the sun through its 12 gates and the careful cycling of the moon through its 29.5-day rhythm, is this: I am faithful. I keep my word. What I have set in motion, I maintain. The sun will rise tomorrow, not because it has no choice, but because the one who governs it has said it will. The seasons will turn not because they are mechanically compelled, but because the governance of the one who designed them has not changed by a single degree since the first light fell on the first morning. God took Enoch outside, in the middle of the worst spiritual crisis in human history, and showed him the stars, not as a distraction, not as a change of subject, as the deepest possible comfort. Look up, Enoch. See how the chaos below is real, and see that the order above is realer. See that my faithfulness is written in light across the entire sky, and that every morning when the sun rises through its appointed gate, it is saying the same word it said the morning before. I have not changed. I will not change. What I have promised, I will do. Tonight, the same sky that Enoch learned to read is above you. The same sun that moved through the ancient gates will rise tomorrow through yours. The same faithfulness is still speaking. It has not taken a single day off, has not been interrupted by any darkness in the world below, has not missed a single appointed gate since Uriel first showed Enoch how to see it. The sky is a letter written in light, and every morning it delivers the same message it has always delivered. There are moments in ancient literature that stop time, not because they are loud or dramatic or surrounded by warnings about their significance, but because when you finally understand what you are reading, something shifts beneath you. You go back and read it again, and each time the weight of it increases. Quietly, the way the sky brightens before sunrise. Not all at once, but by degrees. Each degree making the previous darkness seem more remarkable. This is one of those moments. We have arrived at the section of the Book of Enoch known as the parables, sometimes called the similitudes. It is the second major section of the text, and the one that has generated more scholarly debate, more theological reflection, and more quiet midnight wondering than almost any other passage in ancient literature outside of Scripture itself. Because in the parables of Enoch, written before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, possibly centuries before, there is a figure who sits at the right hand of the Ancient of Days, a figure described as chosen before the creation of the world, a figure who will sit on a throne of glory and judge the living and the dead, a figure whose name, given in the presence of the Lord of Spirits before the sun and the moon and the stars were made, is recorded in this ancient text as the Son of Man. Those of you who know the Gospels know those words. You have heard them in the mouth of Jesus. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven. 80 times across the 4 Gospels, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. It is his most frequently used self-designation, more frequent than Messiah, more frequent than Son of God, the title he reaches for again and again when he wants to say something precise and true about who he is and what he came to accomplish. Scholars have long asked where this title comes from. The phrase appears in the book of Daniel, in a vision. One, like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven, presented before the Ancient of Days, given dominion and glory and a kingdom that will never end. That passage is important, but it is a single vision, a brief and luminous glimpse. The parables of Enoch are something else entirely. They do not glimpse this figure. They dwell with him across multiple extended visions, in language that maps onto the Gospels with a specificity that cannot be explained as coincidence or general religious vocabulary. Listen to what the Book of Enoch says about this figure, and let the connections arrive without being forced. Before the sun and the signs were created, before the stars of heaven were made, his name was named before the Lord of Spirits. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am." And in his prayer in John 17, he asks the Father to glorify him with the glory he had before the world existed. The pre-existence is not a New Testament invention. It was seen by a man on a hilltop in the ancient world. Written down in a book that traveled through Ethiopian monasteries and limestone caves to reach us. He will be a staff to the righteous, that they may lean on him and not fall. He will be the light of the nations and the hope of those who are troubled in heart. In Matthew, Jesus says, "Come ye to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." In John, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness." The images are not similar in a vague, thematic way. They are the same images, carrying the same weight, pointing toward the same person. On the day of his revealing, the kings and the mighty who have built their kingdoms on the crushing of others will fall on their faces before him and find no place to stand. In Philippians, Paul writes that at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. The universal reckoning before the hidden figure now revealed. It is in the parables of Enoch before it is in the letters of Paul. These overlaps are specific. They are not the kind of general similarities that emerge when any two texts draw from a shared pool of religious imagery. They use the same framework, the same theological architecture, the same convictions about a figure hidden before creation and revealed at the end of all things, and they demand an explanation. Honest scholarship requires saying clearly what that explanation is not. It is not settled. The relationship between the Son of Man in the parables of Enoch and the Son of Man in the Gospels is a subject of genuine and ongoing scholarly debate. Some scholars, including George Nicholsburg and James Vanderkam, two of the most respected voices in Enoch scholarship, argue the parables are pre-Christian, that the connections to the Gospels reflect a shared tradition Jesus knew and drew from deliberately. Others have argued the parables may have been composed closer to or even after the time of Jesus, which would change the direction of influence entirely. The honest position is that we do not have certainty about precise dating. What we have is a remarkable body of shared imagery and shared theological conviction that points, whichever direction the influence ran, to a deeply rooted ancient tradition about a figure hidden before the world was made and revealed at its end. What we know from the Gospels themselves is that Jesus chose the title Son of Man deliberately, repeatedly. In contexts where he was clearly making claims his audience recognized as extraordinary. When he stood before the high priest at his trial and was asked directly if he was the Messiah, he answered, "You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." His accusers tore their garments. They understood immediately that he was claiming not merely identity, but cosmic authority. The authority of the figure Daniel had glimpsed and the parables of Enoch had described in detail. Whether Jesus was drawing directly from the Book of Enoch, from Daniel, from a shared oral tradition, or from all of these simultaneously, what he was claiming was unmistakable. I am the one who was hidden before the world was made. I am the one who will sit on the throne of glory. I am the one this ancient tradition has been pointing toward, and the moment of my revealing is now. For those who hold the Christian faith, the connection between the Book of Enoch and the Gospels is not merely intellectually interesting. It is staggering, because it means the coming of Jesus into the world was not an improvisation in response to human failure. It was something anticipated, something a faithful man in the ancient world had been shown in vision before the language of the gospel existed. Before Bethlehem was a name anyone outside Judea had heard. Before a young woman in Nazareth received a visitor named Gabriel, Enoch saw him. He did not know his name as we know it. He did not know the stable or the carpenter's shop or the dusty roads of Galilee. But he saw the throne. He saw the figure at the right hand of the Ancient of Days. He saw the hidden one, chosen before the sun was made, waiting to be revealed. And he wrote it down so that when the revealing came, there would be a witness who had seen it coming from the other side of history. The parables of Enoch are that witness, and what they insist on, across every page, is that the figure they describe is not absent from the world you live in tonight. He is not unaware of what you are carrying. He was chosen before creation for exactly this, for the moment when the hidden becomes fully revealed, when every wrong is answered, when every faithful soul is welcomed, when the full justice of God is enacted, not partially, but completely and permanently. Enoch saw him from a hilltop in the ancient world, carried up through the heavens, shown what no human eye had seen. He wrote it down so that you would know, so that on the night the world feels most broken, most unjust, most irreparably wrong, you would have this testimony from one of the oldest voices in the biblical tradition. I saw him. He is real. He was hidden before the world began. And he is coming. There is a particular kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being physically alone. It is the loneliness of knowing something that the people around you cannot see, of carrying a weight of understanding that has no one to share it with. Not because the people around you are unkind, but because what you know puts you in a category of experience that ordinary conversation cannot reach. You smile at the right moments. You go through the motions of daily life. And underneath all of it, the knowledge sits like a stone in the chest that never quite warms. Noah knew this loneliness intimately. He had lived inside it for most of his adult life. He was the grandson of Methuselah, the longest-lived human in the Genesis record. A man who, by the mathematics of the ancient genealogies, may have overlapped with Adam himself by several centuries. He was the son of Lamech, who named his son Noah, saying, "This one will bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands." A prophecy spoken over a child before the child could understand what prophecy meant, and he was the inheritor, through whatever chain of transmission the ancient world used to preserve what mattered. Of the scrolls, the testimony, the words Enoch had written at God's command and entrusted to his son Methuselah before the light took him. Noah read those words. He understood what they described. And every morning when he walked out of his door and looked at the world around him, he understood, with increasing clarity, the gap between what the scrolls said was coming and what his neighbors were doing with their ordinary Tuesday. Genesis describes the world of Noah's time with a compression that is almost brutal in its efficiency. The wickedness of man was great on the earth. Every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. These are not the words of a culture in decline. They are the words of a culture that has completed its decline and arrived at the bottom. The process that began with Cain's city and Lamech's boast and the Watcher's oath had run its full course. The boundary between what humanity was created to be and what it had become was not blurred. It had been erased. The Book of Enoch fills in the texture of what that erasure looked like from the inside. The violence was not episodic. It was the atmosphere. The forbidden knowledge had been absorbed so completely across so many generations that entire populations had grown up inside it as the assumed shape of reality. The corrupted relationship with the spiritual world was not practiced in secret corners. It was the mainstream, the working of metals for weapons, the manipulation of beauty for control, the reading of the heavens as a system of power rather than a testimony of faithfulness. These were simply how things worked. The children born into this world had no memory of anything else, and Noah walked through it every day, carrying what the scrolls said, watching the world confirm it. The Book of Enoch is specific about something that the Genesis account alone does not fully develop. The corruption was not only moral and cultural. According to this ancient text, it was physical. The ground itself had been altered by what had been done on it and in it. The soil soaked through with the suffering of the innocent. The fabric of the natural order consumed and distorted beyond any pattern of sustainable existence. The creation groaning under the accumulated weight of what the Watchers had introduced and what the Nephilim had enacted and what generations of human complicity had normalized. This is why the flood in the understanding of the Book of Enoch is not primarily punishment. It is surgery. The distinction matters enormously and deserves to be held carefully. Punishment is oriented toward the past, toward what was done and what debt is owed. Surgery is oriented toward the future, toward removing what cannot be healed in place so that what remains can live. A surgeon does not cut because the patient deserves pain. A surgeon cuts, because leaving the corruption where it is will kill the patient. And the patient is worth saving. God looked at the earth in the days before the flood, and saw a patient in whom the contamination had gone too deep and spread too far for any surface treatment to reach. And so he came to Noah, not through an angel, not through a vision at a distance, but directly, in the most intimate form of communication available, and told him what was coming and what Noah needed to do. Make yourself an ark. The instructions that follow in Genesis are precise to the point of architectural specification. Dimensions, materials, the number of decks, the placement of a door and a window, the provision for every category of creature. And at the end of the instructions, a promise. I will establish my covenant with you. Before the first plank was laid, before a single animal walked up a single ramp, the covenant was spoken into existence before the ark existed. Because the covenant was not contingent on Noah's performance. It was contingent on God's character. Noah obeyed. Which sounds simple until you hold it against what obedience actually required of him. There had never been a flood of this scale. There had never been an ark. There was no community of understanding around what he was building. No group of people who looked at the rising wooden structure and nodded with recognition. The world around him was not simply indifferent to what he was doing. It was hostile, in the way that all comfortable systems are hostile to whatever stands as a living accusation against the direction they have chosen. Picture him on an ordinary morning, the sun rising over the hills, casting long shadows across the frame of the structure, taking shape in the valley. The sound of his own hammer, the loudest sound for a long stretch before the world woke up around him. A neighbor passing on the road to market, glancing at what was being built and looking away, with the specific quality of look that communicates, not curiosity, but dismissal. His sons working beside him, old enough to help, but young enough to still ask questions he could only partially answer. Why are we building this? Because God said so. How long do we have to build? As long as it takes. The wood was slow under his hands. The days were long, and the years were longer. And the world around him continued its acceleration toward the bottom, each season darker than the last. The gap between what the scrolls described and what his neighbors were living, growing wider in ways that made the scrolls seem less like history and more like diagnosis. He kept building, one ordinary morning at a time, one plank at a time, one day of choosing God's word over the evidence of his own circumstances at a time. Not because it was glorious or because the neighbors eventually came around or because the loneliness lifted, but because the word had been spoken and the word was enough. Because somewhere in the inheritance of those scrolls, in the memory of a man who had walked with God for 300 years through a world equally dark and equally uncomprehending, Noah had found something that the accumulation of ordinary days could not erode. The ark rose, slowly, implausibly, year after year, plank by plank and beam by beam, in the middle of a world that had decided the only things worth building were things that served the logic of power and appetite and self-sufficiency. Noah built the one thing that didn't. That is what faithfulness looks like from the inside. Not dramatic. Not immediately vindicated. Not rewarded with the approval of the people watching. Just a man in the morning light going back to the thing God told him to do. Carrying the weight of what he knew. Building what nobody around him understood. One unremarkable day at a time. The ark rose, and the sky above it, moving through the gates that Uriel had shown Enoch, kept its faithful rhythm through every year of building. The sun rising and setting, the moon cycling through its phases, the seasons turning in their appointed order, speaking the same word over Noah's hammer that it had spoken over Enoch's prayers. I have not changed. Keep building. I have not forgotten you. When the flood came, it came from two directions simultaneously. The windows of heaven opened. The fountains of the great deep burst forth. Water from above and water from below, meeting in the middle with the thoroughness of something that had been held back precisely long enough and was now released all at once. The valleys filled first. Then the hills disappeared. Then the mountains themselves, those ancient landmarks that every living person had oriented their entire life around, vanished beneath a surface that stretched in every direction without interruption. The world that had been was gone. Noah and his family and the creatures sealed inside the ark rode that surface in a silence that must have been unlike any silence any of them had ever experienced. Not the silence of an empty room, the silence of an empty world. 8 people, and the breathing of animals, and the sound of water against wood. And beyond that, nothing. No city sounds, no voices carrying across valleys, no dogs barking at dusk. Just the vast, complete quiet of a world between its ending and its beginning. The Book of Enoch's contribution to this moment is not in the mechanics of the flood, but in the framework it provides for understanding what the flood was actually doing. The surgery metaphor holds here with full weight. The contamination had gone too deep for any surface treatment. The ground itself altered. The spiritual atmosphere corrupted. The physical and moral fabric of the world so thoroughly saturated with what the Watchers had introduced that only the most comprehensive cleansing could reach all of it. The water reached all of it. But here is what the Book of Enoch adds, that the Genesis account alone leaves in shadow. Before the flood came, heaven had already been at work. The judgments against the Watchers were already accomplished. Raphael had bound Azazel. Michael had sealed Semyaza and the chief Watchers under the hills. Gabriel had turned the destructive energy of the Nephilim inward. The flood was not the first intervention. It was the completing intervention. Heaven had addressed every spiritual dimension of the crisis first, so that when the water came, what it washed away would stay washed away. The flood had a prepared world to cleanse. That preparation is what made the cleansing permanent. Now there is a passage in the New Testament that is among the most debated in all of Petrine scholarship. And it belongs here because it reaches directly into the question of what happened to the people the flood took. The first letter of Peter, chapter 3, says that after his death and before his resurrection, Christ went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, who formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah. The spirits in prison, those who did not obey in the days of Noah, what this proclamation was, what it accomplished, what it means for those who received it. Serious theologians across many traditions have held very different views across many centuries. And the honest position is that certainty is not available. Some understand it as Christ declaring victory to the imprisoned Watchers. Others read it as an offer of some form to the souls of those who perished in the flood. Others interpret the entire passage differently still. What cannot be set aside is the fact of it. An apostle preserved it in a letter that became part of the New Testament. It sits there, quiet and provocative, suggesting that the God of the flood was not finished with the souls the flood took, that the story of those people did not end when the water covered the mountains, that the same God who sent the flood also, in some way the text does not fully explain, sent his Son to where they were. The flood was real. The mercy behind it was real. And the mercy, it appears, did not stop at the waterline. When the waters receded and the ark came to rest on solid ground, Noah stepped off onto earth that was for the first time in generations washed clean. The smell of it must have been extraordinary. The specific freshness of ground that has been thoroughly cleansed. The air carrying nothing of what the old world had saturated it with. A world at zero. A world cleared back to the possibility of beginning again. Noah built an altar. Before he built a house, before he planted a garden, before any act of self-provision, he built an altar. Because the first response to surviving what he had just survived was worship, and God responded with words that have carried human beings through every storm since. He made a covenant with Noah, with his sons, with every living creature on the earth. A covenant so comprehensive in its scope that it left nothing outside its reach. And the sign of that covenant was placed in the sky. A rainbow. Most of us have seen enough rainbows that the weight of them has faded into familiarity. They become weather phenomena. Beautiful, but unremarkable. The kind of thing that makes people reach for their phones rather than stop and stand still. But Enoch, who had been taught by Uriel how to read the language of the sky, who knew that every movement of the sun and moon was a declaration of faithfulness, would have understood the rainbow differently. God said, "When I see the bow in the cloud, I will remember my covenant. I will remember." God who forgets nothing, choosing the language of remembering. Because the covenant was not for God's benefit. It was for ours. We are the creatures who need visible things to hold invisible truths. Who need something in the sky to anchor something in the heart. The rainbow was not a reminder to God. It was a mercy extended to us. Because we are the kind of beings who need to see the promise written in light before we can fully receive it as real. Every rainbow since that first one carries the same testimony, the same promise, the same faithfulness of the same God who sent the flood and stopped the flood and stood on the other side of it with a new beginning already prepared. The new world that emerged from the waters was not paradise. Human sinfulness remained. The story was far from over. The need for the Son of Man that Enoch had seen in the parables was not removed by the flood. It was confirmed by it. Because the flood proved what the pre-flood world had already demonstrated. The deepest problem with humanity is not environmental. It runs deeper than any water can reach. What is needed is what the Son of Man came to give. A cleansing, not of ground and water and air, but of the human soul itself, complete, sufficient, once and for all. The flood was always pointing forward, always gesturing towards something greater, always saying, "This is not the final answer, only the preparation of the world for the one who is." In the spring of 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy named Muhammad ed-Dib was searching for a lost goat in the limestone hills near the Dead Sea. To startle any animals, sheltering inside a cave opening, he threw a stone. He heard not the sound of startled movement, but the sound of breaking pottery. He had stumbled onto one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in human history. But to understand what that discovery meant, we need to trace the long and winding journey the Book of Enoch had taken to reach that hillside. Because the story of how this ancient text disappeared from most of the world, and how it survived in one extraordinary corner of it, is itself a kind of testimony to the themes the book contains. Let us begin not with the disappearance, but with the presence. In the centuries surrounding the birth of Jesus, the Book of Enoch was not an obscure text known only to specialists. It was widely read, widely circulated, and deeply influential across Jewish communities throughout the ancient world. The community at Qumran, whose scrolls Muhammad ed-Dib would eventually uncover, possessed more copies of the Book of Enoch than of almost any other text outside the Psalms and the 5 books of Moses. These were the most serious scripture scholars of their generation, and they considered this book essential reading. The early followers of Jesus knew it too. The letter of Jude, near the very end of the New Testament, does something extraordinary. It quotes the Book of Enoch directly, not vaguely, not as a passing allusion, but as prophecy. Enoch, the 7th from Adam. It says, prophesied about the coming of the Lord with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment on all. That passage comes directly from the Book of Enoch. Jude read it, recognized it as prophetic, and quoted it in a letter eventually included in the New Testament canon. The second letter of Peter references angels who sinned and were cast into chains of gloomy darkness, language that echoes the Book of Enoch's account of the binding of the watchers with a closeness that most scholars consider deliberate. Several early church fathers engaged with it seriously. Tertullian, writing in the late 2nd century, argued the book should be accepted as scripture, maintaining that its preservation across generations was itself a testimony to its authenticity. So what changed? The honest answer requires honesty about a complicated and genuinely human process. As the church grew and spread across the first 3 centuries, the question of which texts carried authoritative weight became increasingly urgent. Different communities in different regions valued different texts. The need to define clearly and consistently what constituted Christian scripture was real, pressing, and impossible to avoid for a movement that was spreading faster than any central coordination could manage. The process of canonization was not a single dramatic decision made in a single room on a single day. It was a long, contested, community-wide discernment unfolding across centuries, shaped by genuine theological reflection and genuine institutional pressures simultaneously. And the criteria that emerged for inclusion were serious. Was the text connected to an apostle or eyewitness of Jesus? Was it consistent with the core convictions already recognized as foundational? Was it received across the major communities of the Church rather than valued only in particular regions? The Book of Enoch did not meet these criteria cleanly. Its origin could not be verified the way apostolic texts could be verified. Its elaborate cosmology raised questions. Its reception was uneven, cherished in some communities, unknown in others, and so gradually, without any single dramatic moment of condemnation, without any council formally banning it or any authority explicitly suppressing it, the Book of Enoch was set aside, not included, allowed to fade from regular reading and teaching in the Western Church the way any text fades when institutions stop actively transmitting it. There is no villain in this story. The people who made these decisions were doing their best with real criteria, trying to protect something genuinely precious. That their best left valuable things outside the boundary is not a scandal. It is the limitation of every human institution that must draw lines. And lines always leave something on the outside, but not everywhere. In one corner of the world, something different happened. The Ethiopian Church, one of the oldest Christian communities on earth, tracing its origins to the conversion of the Ethiopian official described in the Book of Acts, developed its own canon of Scripture. And in that canon, the Book of Enoch was included, not as supplementary reading, not as a historical curiosity, as Scripture, sitting alongside Genesis and Psalms and the Gospels. In the complete collection of texts, the Ethiopian Church considered authoritative and essential for roughly 15 centuries, while the Western Church had largely lost access to the complete text. While European scholars knew the book existed only from references in other ancient sources, while the name of Enoch had become a footnote in biblical studies rather than a living presence in Christian life, the Ethiopian Church was reading it. Monks in monasteries, built into the sides of mountains in communities so remote they were effectively beyond the reach of any external institutional pressure, were copying it by hand in the ancient Ge'ez language, generation after generation, with the patient faithfulness of people who understood that what they were preserving was worth the labor. They did not know they were keeping something alive that the rest of the world had let go of. They were simply preserving what they had received because it seemed true and the truth seemed worth keeping. There is something in that ordinariness that mirrors exactly what the book itself celebrates. The faithfulness that does not announce itself, that does not require an audience, that keeps showing up one unremarkable generation at a time, because the hunger for what is real refuses to settle for its absence. In 1773, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce traveled through Ethiopia and returned to Europe, carrying 3 complete manuscripts of the Book of Enoch. It was the first time most European scholars had encountered the complete text. A full English translation was published by Richard Lawrence in 1821. Scholars began to study it seriously, and the conversation about its age, its theological significance, and its relationship to the New Testament began in earnest. That conversation was transformed permanently by the sound of breaking pottery on a hillside near the Dead Sea. The fragments found in those 11 caves were copied in Aramaic, the language of daily life in first-century Judea, the language Jesus himself spoke. They were dated by paleographic analysis to the last 2 centuries before the birth of Christ, and they matched the Ethiopian manuscripts with the precision of 2 copies made from the same original. For those who had argued the Book of Enoch was a medieval invention, a pious forgery, a late composition dressed in ancient clothing. The Qumran discovery settled the question of age permanently. The book was ancient, genuinely, documentably, verifiably ancient, old enough to have been known to the writers of the New Testament, old enough to have been quoted by Jude, old enough to have shaped the world into which Jesus was born. The Ethiopian monks who copied it by hand in their mountain monasteries did not know about the Dead Sea Scrolls. They could not have imagined that their patient labor across 15 centuries would one day be confirmed by fragments in a limestone cave. They were simply doing what faithful people have always done, preserving what they had been given, because it seemed worth preserving, and it reached us, through breaking pottery, through a shepherd boy's lost goat, through a Scottish explorer's saddlebags, through 15 centuries of monastic faithfulness on a mountain in East Africa. It reached us, the same way Enoch's own walk reached us, one unremarkable day at a time. Muhammad ed-Dib was not looking for ancient manuscripts. He was 17 years old, responsible for a herd of goats, and one of them had gone missing in the limestone hills above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. He threw a stone into a cave, opening the way a teenager with a missing goat and no particular reverence for the hillside would throw a stone, casually, practically, without ceremony. The sound that came back was not what he expected. The breaking of pottery in an enclosed space has a specific quality, a dry, resonant crack that carries differently from the sound of stone on stone. He climbed inside. In the dimness, he found tall clay jars, sealed, ancient, their surfaces filmed with the dust of undisturbed centuries. Inside the jars were scrolls wrapped in linen, preserved by the extreme aridity of the Dead Sea climate in a condition that should not have been possible after 2,000 years. He brought them out into the light, and the world changed, though neither he nor anyone else understood that yet. Over the following decade, systematic archaeological excavation of 11 caves in the same area near the ancient site of Qumran yielded thousands of fragments of ancient manuscripts. The sheer scale of the discovery was unprecedented. Portions of every book of the Hebrew Bible except Esther, community documents, hymns, commentaries, and texts that had been known only by reputation or not known at all. The oldest surviving copies of biblical texts ever found, predating the previously oldest known manuscripts by approximately 1,000 years, and among them, in multiple caves, fragments of the Book of Enoch, written in Aramaic, dated by paleographic analysis, the careful study of letter forms and scribal conventions that allows scholars to estimate when a manuscript was copied, to the last 2 centuries before the birth of Christ. Fragmented, yes, but recognizable, and matching in every detail that could be verified against them, the manuscripts that had been hand-copied in Ethiopian monasteries for 15 centuries. The significance of this matching cannot be overstated. The Ethiopian manuscripts and the Qumran fragments had been separated by geography, by language, by 15 centuries of independent transmission through entirely different communities with no contact between them. If either had been corrupted, if medieval Ethiopian scribes had added material, if the text had drifted significantly across generations of copying, the 2 versions would diverge in detectable ways. They did not diverge. They matched. What this meant was simple and permanent. The Book of Enoch was not a medieval invention. It was not a pious forgery composed in the early Christian centuries and dressed in ancient clothing. It was what it claimed to be, genuinely ancient, circulating in the Jewish world before the birth of Jesus, old enough to have been part of the living religious atmosphere into which the New Testament was written. The community at Qumran that had preserved these fragments deserves more than a passing mention. They were not ordinary readers. The Dead Sea Scrolls as a whole represent the library of a highly disciplined religious community, most likely the Essenes, though that identification remains debated, who had withdrawn from mainstream Jewish society in Jerusalem and established a community of rigorous scriptural study and communal life in the desert near the Dead Sea. They produced some of the most careful copies of Scripture ever found. Their attention to textual accuracy was extraordinary, and they had more copies of the Book of Enoch than of almost any other text outside the Torah and the Psalms. This was not casual familiarity. This was the deliberate, sustained engagement of a community that considered the Book of Enoch essential to understanding the world they lived in and the God they served. They also organized their communal life around Enoch's calendar, the 364-day solar calendar that Uriel had shown Enoch in the astronomical book. Their rejection of the lunar calendar used in the Jerusalem temple was not merely a technical disagreement about timekeeping. It was a theological statement about which tradition represented the authentic original ordering of time and which represented a later corruption of it. They staked their entire communal rhythm, every feast, every Sabbath, every day of fasting and prayer, on Enoch's calendar being correct. These details matter because they prevent the Book of Enoch from being treated as a peripheral curiosity. An interesting footnote in the history of biblical literature. At Qumran, it was central. In Ethiopia, it was canonical. In the New Testament, it was quoted. The marginalization of this text in the Western Christian tradition is a historically specific phenomenon. Real, explicable, not malicious, but not universal and not inevitable. Now, a figure worth pausing on in the recovery of this text is James Bruce, the Scottish explorer whose 1773 journey to Ethiopia brought the first complete manuscripts to European attention. Bruce was not a biblical scholar. He was an adventurer, tall, physically imposing, driven by a restless curiosity about the world that took him across North Africa and deep into Ethiopia, at a time when such journeys were genuinely dangerous undertakings. He went looking for the source of the Blue Nile. He found, along the way, something that would prove more historically significant than any geographical discovery. 3 complete manuscripts of the Book of Enoch, preserved in the Ge'ez language in Ethiopian monasteries, given to him by communities that had been copying and protecting this text for longer than most European nations had existed in their current form. He brought them back to Europe. One he deposited in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. One he gave to the Royal Library in Paris. One he kept for himself. And the text that had been lost to the Western world for over 1,000 years began its re-entry into the conversation. Richard Lawrence's 1821 English translation opened it to a broader readership. Scholars began noticing the connections to the New Testament. The debates about dating and authorship and theological significance began. And when the Qumran fragments arrived in 1947 and the years following, every argument about the book's antiquity was resolved in a single direction. Ancient, authenticated, present in the world into which Jesus was born. The shepherd boy's stone broke a jar that had been sealed for 2,000 years. Inside was something that Enoch had been commissioned to write for future generations, for people living in difficult times who needed to know that the darkness they were inside was not the whole story. The jar held. The linen preserved the scrolls. The scrolls confirmed the Ethiopian manuscripts. The Ethiopian manuscripts confirmed what Jude had quoted. And what Jude had quoted pointed back to a man on a hillside in the ancient world who walked with God for 300 years and was shown things no human eye had seen. The chain of preservation is improbable at every link. A community in the desert keeping copies, while the Western Church let the text fade. A church on an East African mountain copying it by hand for 15 centuries. An explorer looking for a river finding manuscripts instead. A teenager looking for a goat finding a cave. None of it was accidental. All of it was ordinary. The faithfulness that preserved this text across 2 millennia looked exactly like the faithfulness the text itself describes. Unremarkable. Unheroic. One ordinary act of preservation at a time. The same faithfulness that walked with God for 300 years and changed everything. Step back for a moment from the details, from the caves and the fragments and the explorer and the monastery manuscripts, and look at the whole arc of what we have just traced. Because when you hold it at a distance, the shape of it becomes visible in a way that the individual pieces obscure. A man walked with God for 300 years in a world falling apart. He was taken up, shown things no human had seen, and commissioned to write them down. Not for his own generation, not for the people who knew his name and understood his context, but for generations he could not imagine, living in times he had no framework to picture. He wrote it down and entrusted it to his son. His son passed it to his son. His son passed it to Noah. Noah carried it through the flood. The text traveled through the post-flood world by paths we cannot fully reconstruct. Through the patriarchs, through the communities that preserved ancient testimony, through the Jewish world of the centuries before Christ. It was read at Qumran. It was quoted by Jude. It was known by the writers of the New Testament. And then, in the Western Church, it faded. Not dramatically, not by decree, simply by the slow erosion of institutional transmission, when an institution stops actively handing something down. But in Ethiopia, on the other side of the world, from the communities that had produced and initially circulated it, a church received it as scripture, and for 15 centuries, in monasteries built into the sides of mountains, monks copied it by hand, in a language that almost no one outside Ethiopia could read, generation after generation, without knowing whether anyone outside their mountains would ever read what they were copying, without any guarantee that the labor would matter beyond their own community, without any way of knowing that fragments of the same text were sleeping in clay jars in a desert cave, waiting for a shepherd boy who hadn't been born yet. They copied it because it was worth copying. That was the whole of their reason. The text seemed true, and truth seemed worth the labor of preservation. Now hold that image. The monk in the Ethiopian monastery, bent over a manuscript in the lamplight, carefully reproducing words written by a man who lived before the flood, and place it next to the image of Enoch on his hillside at the beginning, the man who climbed to the higher places while his neighbors filled the evenings with noise, the one who looked at the stars with a hunger he couldn't name, who showed up in the presence of God every ordinary morning for 3 centuries. Not because the showing up was glamorous or immediately productive, but because the hunger refused to settle for anything less. The monk in the lamplight and the man on the hillside are doing the same thing. Both are performing an act of faithfulness that looks, from the outside, like it may not matter. Both are preserving something real in the middle of circumstances that don't obviously reward the preservation. Both are choosing, one ordinary day at a time, to tend what they have been given rather than let it fade into the surrounding noise. This is one of the deepest structural arguments the Book of Enoch makes, and it makes it not in words, but in the shape of its own history. The same qualities of faithfulness that the book describes in Enoch's life are the qualities that preserved the book itself across 2.5 millennia. Unremarkable, unheroic, consistent, showing up, refusing to let go of what is real simply because the world around it has stopped paying attention. The text teaches, by existing, its survival is part of its message. And here is what that means for how we hold it. The Book of Enoch did not reach us through dramatic intervention. No angel carried it through the centuries in a blaze of celestial protection. No single inspired individual made a heroic decision that guaranteed its survival. It reached us through the accumulated faithfulness of ordinary people across an extraordinary span of time. Scribes and monks and explorers and archaeologists, and a teenager looking for a goat who threw a stone and heard something break. Every link in that chain is human. Every link is fragile in isolation. And yet the chain held for 25 centuries, which says something about the nature of the truth the book contains. That it is the kind of truth that generates its own preservation, that finds the people willing to carry it forward in every generation, that refuses to be permanently silenced, even when the institutions that should have transmitted it let it slip. There is a moment in this history that deserves particular attention, because it illuminates something essential about how truth travels through time. When Richard Lawrence published his 1821 English translation, he had no idea that his work would be confirmed 126 years later by fragments in a cave near the Dead Sea. When James Bruce packed 3 Ethiopian manuscripts into his saddlebags in 1773, he had no idea that the Qumran community had been reading the same text in Aramaic 18 centuries earlier. When the Ethiopian monks copied the manuscript in the 14th century, they had no idea that their work would one day be compared against fragments dated to the 2nd century before Christ and found to match. No one in the chain of preservation could see the whole chain. Each person could only see their own link, the manuscript in front of them, the translation they were completing, the cave they had just stumbled into. The comprehensiveness of what they were participating in was invisible to each of them individually. Only from the distance of history does the shape become visible. This is also, the Book of Enoch insists, how faithfulness works in a human life. You cannot see the whole chain you are part of. You can only see your link. The ordinary morning in front of you. The choice available to you today. The small act of tending what is real, that no one around you may understand or value. The comprehensiveness of what that faithfulness is contributing to is invisible from where you stand. Enoch could not see that his 300 years of walking would produce visions that would be quoted in the New Testament. He could not see Ethiopian monks. He could not see Dead Sea caves. He could not see you, lying in the dark tonight, hearing his words across an impossible distance. He could only see his hillside, his mourning, his hunger, his God. He showed up anyway, and the words he wrote for people he would never meet. Living in times he could not imagine, traveled through every conceivable obstacle, flood and silence and institutional neglect and geographical impossibility and 2 millennia of ordinary human fragility, and arrived. They arrived tonight. That arrival is not an accident. It is not the product of historical luck or the random survival of one text among many. It is the product of the same faithfulness the text describes, operating across every generation that touched it, preserving something real because real things have a quality that makes them worth preserving, a quality that the people who encounter them recognize, even when they cannot fully articulate what they are recognizing. The message Enoch was commissioned to write for future generations is here. It crossed the world to reach you. It survived everything the world could bring against it. And it is saying, tonight, exactly what it said to the monk in the lamplight and the community in the desert and the earliest followers of Jesus who read it and recognized in it the tradition their teacher was drawing from. The crying reaches heaven. The souls are kept. The Son of Man is real. The faithfulness of God is written in the stars above your roof right now. And the walk that Enoch walked is still available. One ordinary morning at a time. We have traveled a long way together, through fallen angels and heavenly thrones, and the chambers of the dead, and the movements of stars through their appointed gates, through a flood and a rainbow, and Ethiopian monasteries, and a broken clay jar in a limestone cave, through 15 centuries of patient copying by lamplight, and one teenager's thrown stone, and the most significant archaeological discovery of the 20th century. And now we are here, in the quiet, in the dark, in the particular circumstances of your particular life, which are nothing like the pre-flood world, and also in the ways that matter most, not entirely different from it either. So let us sit together before this journey ends and ask the question all of it has been building toward. What does Enoch mean for you tonight? Not for scholars, not for theologians, not for the Ethiopian church or the Qumran community or the historians of the ancient Near East. For you, the person lying in the dark right now, carrying whatever you are carrying. The first thing Enoch's life says is also the most obvious. So let us name it and then go deeper. Enoch lived in a world that was broken in ways he had not caused and could not fix. The corruption around him was not his fault. The Watchers had made their choice before he was born. The Nephilim were not his doing. The spread of forbidden knowledge and the violence saturating the culture of his time were the accumulated consequences of decisions made by beings far more powerful than himself. He woke up every morning in a world that was, by any reasonable measure, catastrophically wrong. And he walked with God anyway, not because the walking fixed the world, The world got worse during Enoch's lifetime. Not better. Not because the walking was rewarded by the people around him. It made him strange. A man who prayed in a generation that had largely stopped praying. Who watched the stars while his neighbors built cities. Who carried a hunger that the culture around him had no category for. He walked because the alternative was to become part of the drift. And something in him, that hunger present since childhood, that pull toward the one who made him, refused to settle for the drift, no matter what the drift offered in its place. You did not cause the brokenness of the world you woke up in this morning either. The systems that grind people down, the inherited patterns that shape us before we are old enough to choose, the spread of things that corrupt and diminish, the weight of powers operating without accountability. You arrived into all of that, the way Enoch arrived into his world. Already in motion, already extensive, already reaching into every corner of the culture around you. The question Enoch's life poses is not what will you do about it, as if you could single-handedly dismantle what took centuries to build. The question is, what will you be inside of it? How will you inhabit the world you woke up in? What will you choose to tend and preserve and keep alive in the middle of circumstances that don't obviously reward the tending? Enoch chose to walk. To keep showing up in that continuous back-and-forth movement the Hebrew word describes, to bring himself, all of himself, the questions and confusions and griefs and perfectly ordinary tired afternoons, into the presence of the God who made him. And that choice, made consistently across 300 years, made him transparent to heaven, made him the vessel through whom the most comprehensive ancient vision of the divine was given. His faithfulness became a vessel, and God filled it. Now go deeper. Because there is something else Enoch's life teaches that is more intimate than the call to walk with God. Something that has to do not with what you do, but with what you believe about yourself, about your worth, about whether you are the kind of person God would bother with at all. Enoch was nobody remarkable in the world's terms. Not a king, not a military commander, not a builder of cities, or an inventor of instruments, or a man of impressive worldly achievement. He was a man who sat on hillsides and watched the stars and prayed. In the culture of the pre-flood world, which celebrated power and ambition and the accumulation of strength, Enoch was quiet, marginal, easily overlooked, and God chose him specifically. Not despite his ordinariness, but through it. Not because he was spectacular, but because he was transparent. Because what God needed was not a powerful person. What God needed was a faithful one. A person whose attachment to the world's definitions of importance was loose enough that heaven could move through them without obstruction. You may feel tonight that you are not the kind of person through whom anything of lasting value flows. That the weight of your history, your failures, your confusion places you outside the category of people God would choose for anything significant. The Book of Enoch says otherwise. With quiet insistence across every page, the man through whom the most comprehensive pre-Christian vision of the Son of Man was given to the world was a man whose entire greatness consisted of this. He walked with God. He refused to let go. He showed up, not because it was glamorous, not because it was immediately fruitful, not because the culture around him respected what he was doing, but because the hunger in him would not settle for anything less than the real thing. That hunger is in you too. It is why you are listening to this in the dark instead of sleeping easily. It is why the story of a man who walked with God 300 years ago still reaches something in you after all these centuries. It is the same hunger, the same pull, the same refusal to be fully satisfied by anything the surrounding culture offers as a substitute for what is real. That hunger is not a weakness. It is a compass. And tonight, it is pointing towards something realer than anything the world around you is offering. Here is the third thing, the deepest thing, the one requiring the most courage to receive. You are already known, not by the world, which sees only the version of you visible from the outside, not by the people around you, who know only what you show them, but by the one whose presence made even the highest angels cover their faces. The one on the throne of fire that Enoch could not look at directly. That one knows you. Not in the general sense that a creator knows a creation. In the specific, named, fully apprehended sense that a father knows a child. Every detail of your history, and your hope, and your fear, and your longing, held in a consciousness that never forgets, never dismisses, never grows tired of holding it. The souls in the chambers of the dead that Enoch saw were being held in exactly that knowing. Known and named, and kept against the day when the full justice and full mercy of God would be enacted completely. If God held those souls through the judgment of the watchers and the destruction of the Nephilim and the cleansing of the flood, He is holding you now, in whatever you are in the middle of tonight, whatever the crisis is, whatever the darkness feels like. You are being held in the same knowing that held those ancient souls. And you are not waiting for the final judgment to experience the warmth of that holding. You are in it now. You have always been in it. Enoch walked with God for 300 years, and at the end of them, God simply could not let him die. Not because Enoch had accumulated enough spiritual merit to earn immortality, but because the relationship, built slowly across 3 centuries of faithful ordinary nearness, had become something that death itself was not adequate to interrupt. Walk with God tonight, tomorrow morning, the morning after that, not because the walking fixes the world, though it changes what the world does to you, not because it makes you important, though it makes you transparent to something more important than anything the world can offer. Walk because the hunger in you is real, and it is pointing toward something realer still. The night is almost over now. The journey that began with 5 quiet words in the 5th chapter of Genesis, he was not, for God took him, has carried us through 2.5 millennia of human history, through fallen angels and flooded earth and limestone caves and Ethiopian mountains, through throne rooms of fire and chambers of the dead and the face of a figure hidden before the sun was made. And now we are still. Everything that needed to be said has been said. Everything that needed to be shown has been shown. What remains is not more information. What remains is the thing that Enoch himself discovered at the end of his long walk. That the presence behind all of it is not a theological proposition to be understood, but a person to be encountered. And that encounter begins not with a vision or a revelation or a dramatic heavenly transportation, but with something far more available than any of those things. It begins with coming near. That phrase, come near, has been the quiet center of everything we have heard tonight. God said it to Enoch trembling on the floor of heaven, too overwhelmed to look up, too undone to stand. He did not say compose yourself first. He did not say you are not ready. Go back and prepare. He said come near. Come near in whatever condition you arrived in. Come near carrying whatever you are carrying. Come near from whatever distance you have traveled and whatever has accumulated along the way. That invitation has not been withdrawn. Not during the worst crisis in the history of the ancient world. Not during 15 centuries, when the book that recorded it was known only in Ethiopian monasteries. Not during all the years between Enoch's last morning on the hillside and this particular night. Not tonight. Come near. Let us pray. Father, we come to you at the end of a long night and a long journey. We have walked together through corridors of fire and ice. We have heard the oath of fallen angels on a mountain top and the crying of a broken earth rising toward heaven. We have stood at the edge of the throne room and looked from a careful and trembling distance at the presence that Enoch could not look at directly. We have heard the name of the one who was hidden before the sun was made. The name given to a child in Bethlehem, centuries after Enoch wrote it down. We have heard the flood come and go. We have watched a rainbow appear in a washed sky. We have followed a book through Ethiopian monasteries, and a shepherd boy's lost goat, and a broken pottery jar in a limestone cave. All the way to this room, to this quiet, to this moment. And now we are still. Father, the things we have heard tonight are larger than any of us can fully hold. We know that. We are not trying to hold all of them. We are only trying to hold you, the one who was behind all of it, the one who sent the archangels and kept the souls, and preserved the scrolls, and set the stars in their courses, and said, "Come near," to the trembling human on the floor. We are trembling, some of us more than others. But all of us are small before what we have heard tonight. Because the world we live in is complicated, and the things we carry are not light. And the distance between how things are and how they should be is not nothing. But you heard the crying of the earth before the flood. You heard the souls in the hollow places of the rock. You heard Enoch weeping in his house on behalf of angels who had no right to ask for mercy. You hear us tonight. We ask for the thing that Enoch had. Not the visions, not the journey through the heavens, not the cosmic revelation or the title of scribe of heaven. Just the thing underneath all of it. The walk. The daily faithful back and forth walk with you that does not depend on how we feel or what the world is doing or whether the circumstances around us are favorable. The walk that Enoch kept for 300 years in a world that was falling apart. Give us that. Give us the hunger that will not settle for the drift. Give us the faithfulness that shows up one unremarkable morning at a time. Give us the quiet clarity that looks at a broken world and still chooses to walk toward you rather than away. And when we lose the thread, when we miss the morning and find ourselves further from you than we meant to get, remind us of what the whole of Enoch's life demonstrated. That you do not let go of the people who refuse to let go of you. That the relationship built across ordinary days becomes, eventually, something that even death is not adequate to interrupt. We are not alone. We know that tonight, in a way we perhaps did not know it when this day began. We have heard the testimony of a man who saw your throne and came back and wrote it all down, and trusted that through all the improbable hands of history, it would reach the people who needed it. It reached us. Thank you. Thank you for the Book of Enoch. For the man who wrote it in faithfulness. For the monks who copied it in obscurity. For the caves that held it in darkness. For the shepherd boy who threw a stone and heard something break. Thank you that the crying reaches the throne. That the souls are kept. That the Son of Man is real and seated and coming. That the rainbow is still in the sky above every storm. Thank you that you say, "Come near." Guard our sleep tonight. Let these words do in us what words cannot do alone. The quiet work of your Spirit in the sleeping soul. Settling truth into places too deep for the waking mind to reach on its own. Let us wake tomorrow a little more like Enoch than we were today. A little more willing to walk. A little less attached to the drift. A little more awake to the faithfulness written in the movement of the stars above our roofs right now. The same stars Uriel showed Enoch. The same faithfulness. The same God. A little more certain that the throne behind the sky is hearing the crying of the earth tonight, the way it heard it then. A little more at rest in the name that was spoken before the sun was made, and given to a child in Bethlehem, and spoken over every soul who has ever chosen to come near. That name is our peace tonight, and every night, now and forever. Through all the ages that Enoch's astronomical visions could calculate, and beyond every boundary they could reach, through Jesus Christ, the Son of Man, the one Enoch saw, the one who came, the one who is coming. To him be all glory. Amen. Sleep well. You have walked a long road tonight, through the oldest mystery in Scripture, through the visions of a man who refused to let go of God and whom God refused to let go of. The words Enoch left behind have waited thousands of years to reach every generation that needed them. They crossed mountains and oceans and centuries, and the silence of institutions and the darkness of limestone caves. They reached you tonight, because you were always going to need to know this. The crying reaches heaven. The Son of Man was seen before the world was made. The faithfulness of God is written in the stars above your roof right now, moving through their gates, keeping their cycles, speaking the same word they have spoken since the first light fell on the first morning. I am here. I am faithful. I have not forgotten you. Come near. Go to sleep now with those words in the deepest part of you. The night has been long. The morning is coming. And when it comes, it will come through the same gates that Uriel showed Enoch, in the same faithfulness that has governed every sunrise since before the flood. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. You are held.